On certain mornings in London, the front pages all look the same politicians pretending they meant to do that, the same stock market numbers marching up and down like soldiers, the same royal photographs that are meant to feel soothing, like a teapot you inherit and never use. Then there was the morning when the newsstands filled with a young woman's face, and the palace realized it had invited a storm inside and politely given it a title. It was not the smile that frightened them, though the smile was bright enough to make strangers feel personally chosen. It was the way she looked straight into the camera, as if it were not a camera at all, as if it were a person who needed something. It was the way the crowd leaned in, as if a few words from her might make their own lives easier. The palace had spent generations perfecting distance. She was doing the opposite, and she was doing it without trying. People would later argue about what she did on purpose and what simply happened around her. But inside those gold rooms and carpeted corridors, no one needed a debate. They could feel it. A monarchy survives on control of emotion. Here was a woman whose presence created emotion the way a match creates flame. The public adored it. The system did not. To understand why she terrified the palace, you have to start far from Buckingham Palace, before the photographers, before the pearls and the tiaras, back when she was still just Diana, with her knees often bruised and her hair not yet trained into a national symbol. She was born on July 1st, 1961, at Park House, on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. It was a grand place to be born if you were looking at the map, and a complicated place to be born if you were looking at the family. Her father was John Spencer, known then as Viscount Althorp, a man shaped by tradition and expectation. Her mother was Frances, young, stylish, and not built for being swallowed by a household that measured worth in male heirs and correct behavior. The Spencers were old aristocracy, the kind that did not have to explain itself. Their names were stitched into English history like embroidery that never comes loose. They were close enough to the royal family to be familiar, yet still outside the central furnace. That closeness is important because it meant Diana grew up knowing the monarchy not as a fairy tale, but as something real people served, feared, and sometimes resented behind polite smiles. Her childhood, however, was not a warm, settled story. It was a story with a crack running through the middle, the kind that children sense even when adults pretend the crack is not there. Her parents' marriage collapsed into public divorce. The fights were not the sort that stayed behind doors. In aristocratic families, privacy is a religion until it is inconvenient, and then it becomes a weapon. Custody battles became bitter. Feelings went unspoken. The house stayed beautiful. The atmosphere did not. Diana was the third daughter before a son arrived. That fact hung over the household in a way no one needed to say out loud. When her brother Charles was born, the relief was immediate, the tension shifting as if a storm cloud had finally moved on. Diana learned early what it meant to be important and yet somehow not essential, loved and yet also measured by what you could provide to the family story. If you look at photographs of her as a small child, you can see the bones of what would come later, the wide eyes that noticed everything, the quick grin that offered peace, the way she seemed both present and elsewhere at the same time, as if she was already practicing how to survive by watching. After the divorce, her father eventually remarried. The new household brought new rules and new discomforts. Diana did not speak later as someone who had been gently carried through childhood. She spoke as someone who had tried to keep everyone happy and found it impossible. She was sent to boarding school as families like hers did. Riddlesworth Hall first, then Westheath Girls' School in Kent. She was not a glittering academic star. She did not shine in the subjects that impressed headmasters. What she did have was something teachers notice, even when grades do not. She had a way of sensing who was lonely. She had a way of making a sad child laugh without making them feel ridiculous. In a school dining hall, that is power. Quiet power, but real. Her shyness was famous later, but it was never emptiness. It was a kind of caution. The caution of someone who learned early that attention can turn. Sharp. Yet she also craved warmth. People who met her as a teenager often remembered the same thing. She listened as if you mattered. That quality, in a royal context, is like bringing a match into a room full of dry paper. When she was older, there was a brief attempt to polish her into something more continental. She spent time in Switzerland at a finishing school. She learned a little about presentation, about language, about the small rituals of being acceptable in high society. But she was not made of marble. She was not a statue to be posed. She was a girl who missed her friends and wanted affection that did not come with a bill. She returned to England and drifted into young adulthood in a way that looked ordinary from the outside and complicated from the inside. She worked, which was not strictly required for someone of her background, but it mattered to her. She babysat. She cleaned. She took jobs that put her around children because children did not judge her by family name. Children judged her by whether she played with them and whether she noticed when they were scared. By 1979, she was living in London with friends, in a small shared flat, doing what young women do when they are trying to become themselves. She rode the underground. She worried about money in the everyday way, even if she had a safety net most people could not imagine. She bought groceries. She laughed at silly things. She probably did not yet understand that her life was already being watched by people who counted bloodlines like coins. The first time Prince Charles entered her story, it was not romance, it was proximity. In 1977, he was seeing her older sister, Lady Sarah Spencer. Diana was 16, he was nearly 13 years older, already carrying the weight of being heir to the throne, and the boredom of always being the most important person in every room. Diana was just the sister in the background, tall and a little awkward, a girl with a soft voice in a world that trained women to speak only when spoken to. Charles noticed her, but not in the way that would matter later. At that point, he was living the restless life of an eligible prince, the kind of life that looks like privilege and feels like confinement. People wanted him to marry. People wanted him to choose. People wanted him to stop being complicated, as if that were a simple request. He was under pressure that was both personal and political. The monarchy needed stability. The family needed an heir, and an heir needed a respectable wife. Respectable meant many things, but in the circles around the palace, it meant the woman should be suitable, uncontroversial, and unlikely to pull the attention away from the institution itself. In plain language, the palace wanted a bride who would not become the headline. It sounds almost funny now, like ordering a cake that is not allowed to taste too good for you. Charles, meanwhile, had already met the person who made him feel most understood. Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles, was not the kind of woman the palace wanted as future queen. She had a past. She had a personality that did not bend for anyone. She was, most dangerously, someone Charles did not have to perform for. Their relationship in different forms was a constant thread in his life. It was the thing he ran toward when the royal machine became unbearable. The royal machine could tolerate many things. It could tolerate affairs as long as they stayed discreet. It could tolerate sadness as long as it stayed silent. What it did not tolerate well was a public mess. By 1980, Charles was approaching 32, and the pressure was no longer gentle. It was not a suggestion. It was an expectation delivered through raised eyebrows, careful conversations, and the silent dread of courtiers who had spent their lives keeping everything neat. That is when Diana came back into his orbit. There are different versions of the exact moment, because stories like this always develop their own mythology. But the general truth is clear. Charles began to see Diana not as a child on the sidelines, but as a young woman who fit the requirements. She was aristocratic. She was beautiful in a fresh, approachable way. She had the Spencer name, a name that came with history and connections. She was close enough to the royal world to understand it, but not so close that she had already been ruined by it. And she had something else that mattered in those rooms. She had no public scandal attached to her. She looked to the palace like a clean page. To Charles, she likely looked like a solution. He was not a villain searching for a victim. He was a man trained from birth to see marriage as duty. He also wanted companionship. He wanted children. He wanted affection that did not feel like a negotiation. He wanted to stop being chased by the same questions at every event. Are you going to marry? When will you marry? Who will you marry? Diana, for her part, was 20, and she was swept up by the sheer force of it. A prince had noticed her. Not just any prince, but the heir. A man whose life was wrapped in history and ceremony. A man whose name carried a kind of magic for people who had never seen the inside of a palace. It is easy to say now that she should have seen the problems. It is easy to say now that the warning signs were obvious. But at 20, when your own family story has already taught you that love can be conditional, and that stability is fragile. The idea of being chosen can feel like salvation. Their early courtship moved quickly in the way royal courtships often do, not because passion is exploding, but because the clock is ticking and everyone is tired of waiting. Diana was invited to places that tested her, not openly, but in the subtle way aristocratic families test newcomers. Weekends at country estates, conversations with people who already knew each other's grandparents, dinners where the wrong fork would not ruin your life, but it would be noticed. Then came Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish estate, a place that functions as both refuge and inspection room. Balmoral is where the family relaxes, which in royal language means they dress down to tweed and still look like they could open Parliament if needed. For Diana, Balmoral was a high-stakes audition. The royal family watched. They watched how she spoke. They watched whether she seemed respectful. They watched whether she could keep up with the endless rituals of politeness. They watched whether she laughed at the right moments. She did well. She was shy, which they found charming. She was attentive, which they found proper. She was young enough to be shaped, which was, to the system, not a flaw, but an advantage. And yet the thing that would later terrify the palace was already present. Diana did not just perform the correct manners, she connected. When she spoke, she made people feel seen. When she listened, she did not do it like a duty. She did it like a person who meant it. The royal family, trained in emotional restraint, found it pleasant. They did not yet realize it was revolutionary. Soon the press began to sniff around the story. Reporters watched her flat. Photographers waited outside her workplace. The British tabloids did not merely report on the royal family, they fed on them. Diana had been a private person. Now she could not step outside without being turned into an image for someone else's profit. That attention did something to her. It scared her, and it also taught her quickly what kind of power the press held. She learned that a photograph could change the mood of a nation. She learned that a headline could define you before you ever opened your mouth. Inside the royal system, dealing with the press was supposed to be controlled, managed by aides who spoke in careful tones and moved like chess players. Diana was not trained for that. She reacted like a human being. She blushed. She hid. She sometimes smiled anyway because she did not know what else to do. The public loved her for it. The palace began faintly to worry. The engagement came in February 1981. When Charles proposed, it was not a long private romance followed by a quiet decision. It was in many ways a collision between fairy tale and timetable. The ring was a sapphire, surrounded by diamonds, dramatic and instantly recognizable, the kind of object designed to be photographed as much as worn. The ring mattered because it sent a message. This is serious. This is royal. This is forever. They sat for an interview as royal couples do, and the famous question came, "Are you in love?" Charles gave an answer that sounded, even then, odd. "Whatever love means." Diana laughed because what else could she do? In that moment her laugh was treated as sweetness, as girlish charm. But it also revealed something painful. She was stepping into a marriage where even the language of love was not simple. The palace, however, looked at the engagement and saw success. The heir had chosen a bride. The bride was suitable. The public was thrilled. The newspapers printed her fate like a national prayer. The institution could breathe again. But for Diana, the engagement was not a soothing conclusion. It was the beginning of a new kind of loneliness. She moved closer to the royal world, and the world did not move closer to her. She was suddenly surrounded by protocol, by people whose job was to manage the monarchy, not necessarily to care for the young woman entering it. She began to see more clearly how the family operated, how emotions were filed away, how problems were ignored until they became unavoidable, how conversations could be polite and still feel like ice. She also began to sense that there were rooms she could not enter, not physically, but emotionally. Charles had his own life, his own friends, his own routines, and quietly his own attachments. Diana had given up her ordinary world for him, and he had not given up his for her. This imbalance matters because it explains the fear that would come later. The palace could handle an unhappy marriage if it stayed tidy. What it could not handle was a young woman who could not be kept tidy, not because she was rude or reckless, but because she was too emotionally alive to be folded neatly into the furniture. As the wedding approached, preparations became a machine. Dresses were designed with secrecy. Guest lists were managed like treaties. Flowers were ordered in quantities that made ordinary weddings look like a casual brunch. Money flowed quietly, the way it does around royalty. Some things were paid for by the royal family, some by Diana's family, some absorbed by the vast apparatus that turned ceremony into national theatre. It was not discussed in public in a blunt way, because the monarchy survives partly on the illusion that these things happen naturally, like roses blooming. But none of it was natural. It was planning and labor and enormous cost justified by the promise of stability. Diana's life, meanwhile, shrank. Her movements were watched. Her words were reported. Friends became risks. Strangers became judges. The simple act of going out could turn into a chase. She was also facing the emotional reality that the public did not see. A wedding dress can be fitted perfectly, while the bride feels like she is disappearing inside it. She was very young, and she was about to marry into a family that treated vulnerability like a minor scandal. What the palace wanted from her was clear. Smile, wave, produce airs. Do not embarrass anyone. Learn quickly. Do not complain. What Diana wanted was also clear, though she may not have said it out loud. She wanted love that felt safe. She wanted to belong. She wanted a home that did not crack under her feet. As July 1981 drew near, London took on the mood of a national celebration. Souvenirs appeared in shop windows. People planned street parties. They treated the wedding as a story they could live inside for a day, a chance to feel hopeful in a country that was wrestling with economic strain and political tension. The strange thing about royal weddings is that they are sold as romance, but they are built as performance. The performance can be beautiful, even moving. It can also be unforgiving. Diana stepped into that performance with the eyes of the world on her, and she did something the palace had not predicted. She looked like the kind of bride people could imagine being, not distant, not carved from stone, but nervous and radiant, like someone who might actually feel the moment rather than simply represent it. On July 29, 1981, the day arrived. The carriage, The crowds, the cathedral, the choir, all of it was designed to make history feel alive. St. Paul's Cathedral filled, with guests who carried titles like inheritance. Diana's dress unfurled in yards of fabric, a train so long it required its own strategy. When she walked, the country watched her, as if watching its own hopes walk down the aisle. And for a moment, it worked. The spectacle did what it was supposed to do. The monarchy looked young again, the air looked settled. The nation exhaled. But even in the glow of that day, there were tiny human details that hinted at what was coming. The way Diana clung slightly to the ritual, as if it might hold her up. The way Charles, trained in restraint, seemed both present and elsewhere. The way the vows sounded eternal while the people making them were not being asked what they truly needed. After the ceremony, there was a balcony kiss, a brief moment of public affection that became iconic. It looked like the ending of a story. It was, in reality, the moment the story began to tighten like a knot. The palace believed it had secured the future. It believed it had chosen a bride who would support the institution and disappear politely behind it. What it had actually done was place a woman with extraordinary emotional radar and extraordinary public magnetism right at the center of the royal machine. At first, the fear was not loud. It was not a crisis meeting. It was a quiet awareness among aides, among courtiers, among the people who survived by anticipating trouble. They watched how the public reacted to her. They watched how she reacted to the public. They watched the way cameras found her, even when they were meant to be filming someone else. She was not supposed to outshine the system. She was not supposed to become the story. And yet, as the newlyweds began their first steps into married life, as the confetti settled and the bouquets wilted, the palace was already learning the uncomfortable truth. You can teach someone protocol. You can train them to curtsy. You can tell them which doors to use and which words to avoid. You can instruct them on how to wave without waving too much. But you cannot easily train someone out of being real. And once the world has seen real, it becomes hard to sell them distance again. And once the world has seen real, it becomes hard to sell them distance again. The first weeks after the wedding was supposed to be the gentle part, the private part, the part where a young couple learns each other in peace. The problem was that nothing in their lives was designed for peace. Even their quiet moments belonged to a schedule. Diana moved through Buckingham Palace like a guest who had overstayed without meaning to. The building was grand, but it was grand in the way a museum is grand. You do not relax in a museum. You whisper. You wonder where the exit is. You feel watched even when no one is there. The staff were everywhere and nowhere. Doors opened before she reached them. Tea arrived when she had not asked. People appeared with folders, with decisions already half made, with smiles that said, "We are here to help," and eyes that said, "We are here to manage." Charles slipped back into his old life almost immediately. He had briefs to read, meetings to attend, patronages to serve. He had a routine formed over decades of being treated as inevitable. Diana had no routine at all. She had been a young woman with friends and small jobs and ordinary freedoms. Now she was an object of national interest who could not pop out for milk without someone calling it a scandal. In public, they were the perfect picture. In private, they were two people with very different ideas of what a marriage felt like. The honeymoon should have been romantic. It was, in fact, educational. They went on the royal yacht Britannia, a floating symbol of tradition, polished wood and uniforms, and the quiet sound of hierarchy. The Mediterranean sun did not change the basic truth that Charles knew how to be a prince in every setting. And Diana did not yet know how to be anything at all in this new life. She tried. She leaned into the role with the sincerity of someone who believes effort can solve everything. On deck she wanted closeness, Charles wanted calm. She wanted conversation. He wanted to read, to paint, to write letters. She tried to join him, perched beside him with books and smiles, ready to become the companion he had always been told he needed. But companionship is not the same as performance, and performance has a way of exhausting the performer. The yacht had staff, of course. Privacy existed only in theory. Even silence could feel staged, because someone was always nearby, listening for a bell, watching for a cue. Diana, who had grown up around servants, still felt the weight of being watched. It is one thing to be served at a country house where the staff have known you since childhood. It is another thing to be served by strangers who know you only as a job. From Britannia, they went to Balmoral, which was meant to be the true honeymoon, away from the press, away from the city, wrapped in the family's private world. Balmoral was beautiful. It was also a place with rules that were never written down, because the people who set them believed they were as natural as air. The family liked outdoor life, long walks, shooting, fishing, evenings built around conversation that sounded casual, until you realized you were being judged by it. Diana had done well there before, but that was as a girlfriend being assessed. Now she was a wife being absorbed. There is a difference. Charles loved Balmoral because it felt like his own. Diana, in those early days, tried to love it too. She wore the right clothes. She smiled at the right jokes. She worked hard to be cheerful, as if cheerfulness were a kind of currency she could spend to buy belonging. But the more she tried, the more the loneliness pressed in. At night, she was not a child visiting an estate. She was a young bride living inside someone else's family story. Everyone around her had known each other forever. Their memories fit the place like furniture. She had arrived yesterday. And there was something else, a presence that was not in the room but that shaped the room anyway. Camilla was not on the honeymoon. She did not have to be. She existed as an idea, as a name spoken carefully, as a topic that made people glance away too fast. Charles carried her in his life like a familiar key in his pocket. Diana did not yet have proof of anything she could name publicly. She had feelings, hints, small moments. She noticed what a wife notices, even when she is trying not to notice. She sensed where his attention went when it was not on her. She heard the tone of his voice when certain names were mentioned. She saw how he lit up when he spoke about certain friends. She learned, painfully, that marriage does not automatically become the center of a man's emotional life just because it is the center of his public duties. Back in London, the routine began. Diana was given rooms, staff, schedules. She was introduced formally and informally to the strange shape of palace life. There were private secretaries and press officers and ladies-in-waiting, all with decades of experience and a firm belief that the monarchy survived because people like them never let anything become unpredictable. Diana was, by nature, unpredictable, not because she wanted chaos, but because she was alive in a way the system found hard to contain. She learned quickly how little control she had over her own time. When she would visit places, what she would wear, who she would meet, even how she would travel. The royal household planned it all, and the planning was not cruel, it was simply automatic. This was how it had always been done. The household assumed she would want guidance. It did not occur to the household that she might want a life. There were also the rules about gifts, which sound trivial until you understand what they represent. People gave her things constantly. Flowers, letters, stuffed animals, jewelry, handmade quilts, odd little objects that had been saved for years because someone believed this was the moment to offer it. It was love, expressed through objects. The household treated gifts as potential problems. Gifts had to be recorded. Some were kept, some were stored, some were quietly passed along to charity. Certain items belonged to the crown, not to the person. A diamond brooch was not a diamond brooch. It was a responsibility. Even a teddy bear could become a news item if it was handled the wrong way. Diana, who felt the weight of those gifts as human messages, was told gently but firmly that the system would take care of it, which meant the system would take it away. This was the first place where her instincts and the institution collided. She was not a woman who saw a crowd and thought, "How do we exit efficiently?" She saw a crowd and thought, "How do I reach them?" The household saw crowds as security to sorry risks and scheduling threats. She saw crowds as people. The press noticed immediately. They noticed the way she turned toward children, the way she crouched down to speak to them, the way she made old women laugh by leaning in close as if they were sharing a secret. These were small gestures, and they made enormous photographs. In royal circles, a photograph is never just a photograph. It is power. The newspapers began to write about her, like she was a new national treasure. They called her shy, then called her glamorous, then called her the people's princess before anyone stopped to think what that phrase really meant. It meant the public felt they owned her. It also meant the palace did not. Charles began to feel something he had not expected. He was used to being admired, but he was not used to being eclipsed. In his own marriage, at his own engagements, the cameras followed her face, her clothes, her expressions, her warmth. When he spoke, reporters still wrote about her smile. When he walked into a room, the room looked past him. This did not make him evil. It made him human, and humans are not always generous when they feel ignored. Diana, meanwhile, did not experience her popularity as pure joy. It was flattering, yes, and it was intoxicating in the way approval can be intoxicating to someone who has often felt unwanted. But it was also pressure. People wanted her to be everything. Perfect wife, perfect princess, perfect symbol. She could barely manage breakfast without wondering if it would be in tomorrow's paper. Inside the marriage, she was desperate to do it right. And doing it right, she believed, meant being loved. That is where the pain began to fold in on itself. Diana's body became a battleground. When she felt she could not control her days, her schedule, her husband's moods, she tried to control the one thing that was hers, at least in theory. Her eating became disordered. Bulimia, the illness that would later become part of her public story, began to grip her in private. She felt ashamed, and she hid it, which is what shame always demands. The palace, built to hide things, did not know what to do with an illness that could not be folded into ceremony. In that world, people did not talk about mental health. They certainly did not talk about a princess vomiting in private because she felt unloved. It did not fit the brand. For a while, everyone pretended not to see. Diana began her royal work, public engagements, visits to hospitals, schools, charity events, community centers, the kind of calendar that looks light on paper until you are the one standing in heels for hours, smiling through exhaustion and remembering the names of strangers because you can see how much it matters to them. She was good at it. Almost immediately, she was good at it. She did not do it like a task. She did it like a conversation. People told her things they did not tell other royals. They cried in front of her. They joked with her. They touched her arm, and she did not recoil. The household did not like strangers touching royal bodies. Royal bodies were supposed to be symbolic, not accessible. Diana did not understand why it was such a problem to let a grieving woman hold her hand for a moment. The household understood it very clearly. If you let people touch you, they start to believe you belong to them. And Diana did belong to them, at least emotionally. At some engagements, her presence made the official host fade into the background. Men who had invited the Prince of Wales to open a building found themselves watching the Princess of Wales kneel down to speak to a child with a bandaged arm, and suddenly the building felt secondary. Charles, who had spent years building his own identity, as a serious man with serious interests, began to resent the way she could steal the scene without even trying. He wanted to talk about architecture, about the environment, about the future of the nation. She wanted to talk to the nurse who had worked a double shift. Both had value. Only one made the front page. At home, the arguments were not screaming scenes every night, but the tension was constant. The kind of tension that makes ordinary conversations feel sharp. One remark becomes an insult. One silence becomes a verdict. Diana would later describe herself in those early months as lonely, as lost. She had expected marriage to bring closeness. Instead, it brought a larger stage and a colder backstage. She tried to find allies. Some staff adored her because she treated them like people, asked after their families, remembered their birthdays. Some staff disliked her because warmth can look like weakness to those trained to respect only rank and routine. She was emotional. She cried. She asked questions. She wanted explanations. In that world, questions can be seen as criticism. The older royals watched her closely. The Queen's style was disciplined and contained, shaped by a lifetime of being careful. Prince Philip believed in toughness, in getting on with it. The Queen Mother was charming and formidable, a woman who understood public performance better than most performers. They did not all see Diana the same way, but they all understood that she was changing the atmosphere around the family. Some of them were pleased. A young princess with star power was useful. Some of them were uneasy. Star power can turn into something else, something you cannot order around. And then, in late 1981 and into early 1982, a new pressure arrived in the most predictable way possible. The question of an heir. No one said it bluntly to her face in a cruel way, but it floated in the air like smoke. A child would secure the line. A child would calm the press. A child would make the marriage look settled. A child would anchor her to the institution in the only way the institution truly trusted. Diana became pregnant. The public reaction was immediate delight. It was as if the country had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The palace relaxed in public the way an old house relaxes when the foundation feels solid again. But pregnancy did not make Diana feel secure. It made her feel more exposed. Her body changed in front of cameras. Her emotions intensified. Her vulnerability became obvious, and obvious vulnerability was not something the palace knew how to wrap in velvet. Charles, who might have been expected to soften, did not always. He had been raised to view pregnancy as a duty fulfilled, not as a tender event requiring constant reassurance. He could be kind. He could also be distant, as if the pregnancy were happening near him rather than with him. Diana's sense that she was not truly loved deepened. And then came an incident that the palace would have preferred to erase entirely. In early 1982, while pregnant, Diana had an argument with Charles at Sandringham. The details have been told and retold, but the heart of it was simple. She felt unheard. She felt dismissed. She felt trapped in a marriage where her pain did not change the tone of the room. In a moment of desperation, she threw herself down a staircase. It was not a theatrical scene, not a melodramatic gesture meant for applause. It was frightening. It was dangerous. It was the act of someone who could not find another way to communicate how bad it had become. The household reacted with alarm and then with silence, because silence was the only language it trusted. Diana survived. The baby survived. But something else happened that mattered just as much. People around her saw that she was not simply unhappy. She was in crisis. She was not a decorative problem. She was a human problem, and human problems do not respond to protocol. The palace did what it often did and moved on briskly, as if moving on could scrub away the meaning. Diana, however, did not move on emotionally. She stored the memory the way trauma stores itself, as proof. proof that she could fall and the institution would steady itself and keep walking. As her pregnancy progressed, she made choices that were small rebellions. She wanted to give birth in a hospital, not at home. Royal births had tradition, but tradition is not always practical. She wanted medical care she trusted. She wanted a sense of normalcy, even if normalcy in her life now meant cameras camped outside the doors. On June 21st, 1982, she gave birth to a son, Prince William, at St. Mary's Hospital in London. The name was a statement. William, a future king's name, heavy with history. The boy was instantly a symbol. The public celebrated. Newspapers printed photographs of Diana leaving the hospital in a dress that looked deliberately simple, holding her baby as if she were any new mother stepping out into the sun. But she was not any new mother. She was the mother of a future king. The world treated that as a fairy tale. The palace treated it as a matter of state. Diana treated it as her child. She wanted to be present in his life in ways royal mothers had not always been allowed to be. She insisted on feeding schedules that suited the baby, not the diary. She wanted to choose his nanny carefully. She wanted to hold him herself, not hand him off as if affection were a job to be delegated. This was not just maternal instinct, it was also strategy. Diana understood even then that her child would be shaped by the institution. If she wanted him to be human, she would have to fight for his humanity. That fight began in the nursery. The household had opinions, so did the family. A royal baby is never only the parent's baby. A royal baby belongs, in a complicated way, to the crown. Every decision becomes a negotiation. Which doctor, which nurse, which nanny, which photographs are released, when the baby is shown, when the baby is hidden. Diana's protectiveness clashed with the system's need for control. At the same time, her public work continued, because the machine does not. Pause for motherhood. When she returned to engagements, the crowds were louder than ever. They cheered for the new mother, for the young princess, for the woman who made them feel something. In those moments, Diana began to understand her own power. Not power over laws or money, but power over emotion, which, in a monarchy, is not a small thing. She could turn a routine visit into a national conversation simply by where she placed her attention. She began to choose causes that mattered to her, not only the safe causes assigned by committees. She was drawn to hospitals, to children, to people who were suffering quietly. The establishment preferred tidy charities that looked good in annual reports. Diana preferred the messy parts of life that did not photograph neatly, and then she somehow made them photograph anyway. This created a new kind of anxiety in the palace. The royal family had long supported charities, but they did it with distance. Diana did it with intimacy. She touched people, she looked into their eyes. She stayed longer than scheduled because someone was still talking. Aides hated that, not because they were heartless, but because schedules are the skeleton of royal life. If she broke the schedule, she broke the control. If she broke the control, she created risk. A crowd can turn. A moment can be misread. A photograph can be twisted. A single unscripted remark can become a week of headlines. Diana was not reckless with words. She was reckless, from the institution's point of view, with feeling. She let it show. That was the danger. At home, her marriage did not heal with the baby. In some ways it worsened, because now there was even more at stake. Charles felt pressure to be a family man in public, and he also felt that the public adored his wife more than they adored him. Diana felt that the baby had not brought her closer to her husband. It had simply bound her more tightly to a life that was already hurting her. There were moments of tenderness. Photographs exist of the family looking almost normal, Charles holding the baby, Diana smiling. Those moments were not fake. They were fragments of what might have been. But fragments are not a foundation. Charles and Diana had different temperaments, different love languages, different ideas of what a day should feel like. Charles preferred solitude and long conversations with people who shared his interests. Diana preferred laughter, touch, closeness, the kind of warmth that fills a room quickly. Charles often found her emotional needs exhausting. Diana often found his distance cruel. And behind all of it, there were the friends, the circles, the old attachments. Charles's world was filled with people who had known him forever, and who treated Diana as an addition, not as the center. Diana's world, the world she was building through her own popularity, was filled with people who felt personally devoted to her, and that devotion made others uneasy. Even within the staff, lines began to form. Those who saw her as the future, fresh and necessary. Those who saw her as a risk, too sensitive, too dramatic, too likely to embarrass the family. Diana could feel those lines. She had always been good at sensing who liked her and who merely tolerated her. In the palace, tolerance is often served with a smile so perfect it feels like a wall. She learned to read the walls. She also learned slowly that she could push against them. Her wardrobe became part of the story because clothes are never just clothes in that world. Her dresses were discussed like political statements. Designers competed for the chance to dress her. Some wanted the prestige, some wanted the business. Some wanted to be part of a modern fairy tale. The palace worried about appearances, but in a different way. They worried about cost, about propriety, about whether she looked too glamorous, too fashion-forward, too likely to distract from the work. At the same time, they understood that her style was a tool. People paid attention to her because they liked looking at her, and then, while they were looking, she could make them care about something else. That is a kind of power that does not show up in budgets, but it is still power. It can move money. It can move donations. It can make a neglected charity suddenly fashionable, which sounds silly until you realize fashionable means funded. Diana's popularity brought in value for the institution, and it also threatened the institution's hierarchy. The monarchy is built to center the crown, not the spouse. Diana was a spouse who began to feel like the center. By late 1982, people close to the couple could no longer pretend everything was fine. The strain showed in small ways, in the stiffness of photographs, in the careful distance in public, in the way Diana's face sometimes fell when Charles spoke, in the way Charles seemed to retreat into his own seriousness, as if seriousness could protect him from being emotionally outpaced. The public still wanted the fairy tale. The newspapers still printed the smiles, but inside the palace, the fear was taking a clearer shape. They had brought in a young woman to steady the monarchy. Instead, they had brought in someone who made the monarchy feel, and feeling is harder to manage than any protocol. And the most unsettling part was this. The more Diana struggled behind closed doors, the more she seemed to shine in public, as if her private pain were being transformed into public empathy. People did not know the details. They did not need to. They sensed, instinctively, that she carried something heavy, and they loved her for not letting it harden her. To the palace, that was not simply charisma, it was a warning. Because a royal family can survive a cold marriage, it can survive private sadness. What it cannot easily survive is a princess who turns sadness into a bond with the public that the institution does not control. And now there was a baby, a future king, and a mother who was already learning how to fight in a place where no one ever called it a fight. The next question was not whether Diana would become more confident. She already was. The next question was what she would do with that confidence once she realized fully what it could cost everyone around her. The next question was what she would do with that confidence once she realized fully what it could cost everyone around her. At first, she did what many young women do when they feel a marriage slipping through their fingers. She worked harder. She tried to be easier, brighter, more agreeable. She tried to become the kind of wife she imagined Charles wanted, the kind of wife who did not need anything complicated, the kind of wife who could float through dinners and weekends with a pleasant smile and no sharp questions. But Charles was not looking for a pleasant smile. He was looking for relief. Relief from pressure, relief from expectation, relief from the constant demand to be the future. And Diana, with all her feeling, was not relief. She was a mirror. She reflected his coldness back at him, not in cruelty, but in pain. That kind of reflection makes a person either soften or harden. Charles often hardened. The household treated this as a private matter, which in royal terms meant it did not exist until it threatened the front page. They focused on the appearances that could be controlled. Photographs, public engagements, tours. A tour in that world was not a trip. It was a moving stage. It had routes planned down to the minute. It had outfits matched to weather and culture. It had dinners where the cutlery felt like it had been polished by fear. It had security, speeches, receptions, handshakes, and the constant question in every age head, will anything happen that we cannot manage? In 1983, the answer became yes, in the most dramatic way, and it began with a decision that sounded small on paper. Diana wanted to take William with them. Royal tours had always involved separation. The older generation believed it built resilience, and also, very conveniently, it prevented the public from seeing anything too tender or too human. Babies did not belong on tours. Babies belonged in nurseries with nannies while their parents performed duty like adults. Diana refused. She said she would not go without her child. It was not a tantrum, it was a boundary, and boundaries were not a thing the palace enjoyed. The palace preferred compliance, the kind that comes wrapped in gratitude. The discussion went on quietly, behind closed doors. Courtiers raised concerns about security and logistics, all reasonable on the surface. The deeper concern was more delicate. If Diana could insist on this, what else could she insist on? If she succeeded, others might notice she could succeed. In the end, the institution bent. William would come. He would be kept mostly out of sight. There would be careful management. The system told itself it was still in charge. In March 1983, Charles and Diana set off for Australia and New Zealand, with their baby and a small army of staff. The tour was meant to strengthen ties, to show the Commonwealth a young royal family with a future. It was also, though no one put it in writing, meant to test Diana to see if she could handle the pressure. She handled it, and then she did something far more alarming. She seemed to enjoy it. Australia greeted her like a star. People lined streets for hours, and they climbed trees, they stood in the sun, with children on their shoulders, just to glimpse her hair, her smile, her movement. They screamed her name, not his, not the crown's, hers. She stepped out in bright dresses that caught the light, and the crowds reacted as if colour itself had been invented that morning. She did not walk like a person trying to be important. She walked like a person trying to connect. She reached for hands. She listened. She leaned in. She laughed. She looked directly at faces. That directness had an effect. It made people feel chosen. And when people feel chosen by a princess, they do not forget it. Charles watched this unfold beside her, and something complicated moved across his face in photograph after photograph. He was proud sometimes. He was also left out sometimes. He had been trained to believe the monarchy was the central sun, and everyone else orbited. On that tour, it began to look as if the crowd's gravity pulled toward her. At receptions, men and women maneuvered to stand near her. At walkabouts, people pushed forward for her hand. At official functions, hosts whispered about her charm. The press wrote about her clothes, her gestures, her warmth, as if she were the tour and the rest was background. In private, The strain between Charles and Diana grew sharper, not because of any single event, but because the tour put their differences under a magnifying glass. Charles wanted discipline. Diana wanted affection. Charles wanted order. Diana wanted closeness. Charles wanted her to follow the plan. Diana followed the plan, and then she went beyond it, because she could not help herself. When a child cried, she stopped. When a mother spoke, she listened. When someone in the crowd looked overwhelmed, she noticed. The aides hated it. They tried to move her along. They tapped their watches. They whispered, "Your Royal Highness, we must go." She nodded, and then she stayed a few seconds longer anyway, because to her, those seconds were the point. The public loved it. They saw a princess who seemed to mean what she was doing, and the public's love was loud enough that it became its own form of protection. It is hard to scold a woman in private when the world is applauding her in public. The tour also revealed something personal about Diana that made the palace uneasy. She had a gift for turning tension into performance, not in a fake way, but in a resilient way. She could walk out of a private argument and still appear calm and radiant on a stage. She could swallow tears and then smile at strangers with real warmth. It looked like strength. It was also a warning. She could survive pain and still win the crowd. When the tour ended and they returned home, the household hoped things would settle. The opposite happened. Diana came back changed, not completely, but enough. She had seen what her presence did to people. She had felt the surge of affection. She had understood, perhaps for the first time, that she was not just a supporting figure, she was a force. Charles, meanwhile, returned to his private world with a sense of bruising he did not know how to name. He was not a man trained to say, "I feel threatened." He was trained to say nothing and let discomfort curdle into distance. Back in London, Diana's days filled with engagements. The palace tried to guide her into safe courses and safe appearances. She accepted many. She also began quietly to shape her own path. She liked hospitals. She liked children. She liked the parts of society that did not look polished because they felt honest. She did not feel comfortable in boardrooms full of wealthy men praising each other for donating money they would never miss. She felt more comfortable in a children's ward where the air smelled of disinfectant and fear and hope, and the nurses were too busy to flatter her. Those choices had consequences. Every charity she touched became more visible, donations rose, media attention followed. The palace appreciated the positive headlines, but it also worried about the precedent. Diana was turning royal work into something personal. Personal is hard to control. The household tried to contain her in smaller ways. They suggested which outfits were appropriate. They tried to schedule her more tightly. They advised her to avoid certain spontaneous gestures. They reminded her, always politely, that she represented the crown, not herself. Diana listened, and then she did what she always did. She went out and acted like herself anyway. In those months, her bulimia worsened. It was fueled by anxiety, by isolation, by the constant pressure to be perfect. And there was the simple, brutal fact that her marriage did not offer comfort. When you cannot rest in your own home, your body becomes a place you try to manage. The illness gave her an illusion of control. It also drained her, physically and emotionally. Some staff noticed. A few tried to help in quiet ways. Many did not know what they were seeing, or they looked away because looking away was an advanced skill in those buildings. Diana also began to experience mood swings that frightened her, not because she was weak, but because she was overwhelmed. She was young, under global scrutiny, married into a cold family, and expected to produce a perfect image every day. Her emotions did what emotions do when they are trapped. They spilled. The palace had one method for dealing with spilling emotion. It tightened the lid. Charles dealt with her suffering in a way that made sense to him and hurt her deeply. He became irritated. He withdrew. He treated her distress as inconvenient. He could be kind in moments, but his kindness often had a clipped edge, the kindness of someone who believes he is doing his part and wishes the problem would stop. Diana interpreted this as rejection, and rejection was the oldest wound in her life. It is hard to overstate how much that wound shaped her. When she felt rejected, she did not become calm. She became desperate, is ruminating for reassurance, and desperation is rarely attractive to the person being asked to provide it. So the cycle continued. Around them. In 1984, a second pregnancy arrived, and with it, a second chance, at least in the minds of those who liked simple stories. A second baby would make the family look complete. A second baby would quiet gossip. A second baby would bring Charles and Diana closer. If one baby did not fix the marriage, perhaps another would. This is a belief people cling to because it sounds hopeful, and because admitting the truth is harder. Diana was tired. She was still doing engagements. She was still smiling. She was still trying to be a good wife and a good princess, and a good mother while privately feeling like she was disappearing. Charles wanted another child, partly out of duty and partly out of his own desire for a family that looked stable. He was also aware, though he rarely said it plainly, that the monarchy needed more than one heir. It needed a spare. The language is blunt because the reality is blunt. A second son protected the line. On September the 15th, 1984, Diana gave birth to Prince Harry, again at St. Mary's Hospital. The arrival should have been pure joy. It was joy in her eyes because she loved her children fiercely. But it also brought a new fracture. Charles reportedly reacted with disappointment that the baby was not a girl, not because he disliked his son, but because he had wanted a daughter, a softer dream within the hard architecture of his life. He had imagined a little girl. He got another boy. He made a remark that stung. Diana absorbed it like a bruise. She did not forget. She was good at remembering the exact moment. She felt diminished. She carried those moments like evidence. The palace, as always, focused on the image, the young family, the two boys, the future secured. Photographs were released, smiles were presented, the public cooed, the newspapers printed the story as if it were the second big chapter of a fairy tale. But inside the marriage, the fairy tale was now a set of obligations. Diana threw herself into motherhood. She insisted on being hands-on. She wanted William and Harry to know love, not simply duty. She wanted them to see ordinary life, not just formal life. She took them to places royal children did not usually go. She wanted them to meet people outside their bubble. She wanted them to understand from the start that the world did not revolve. This was partly compassion and partly strategy. Diana sensed that the institution would try to shape her sons into symbols. She wanted them to be human first. She wanted them to feel things. She wanted them to recognize suffering when they saw it, not to float past it in a car. Some in the palace found this admirable. Some found it worrying. A royal child who understands too much can become hard to manage as an adult. Charles, meanwhile, had his own relationship with the boys. He cared for them, and he also found the noise and disorder of small children exhausting. He liked calm. Babies and toddlers are not famous for calm. Diana was more playful, more physically affectionate. Charles was more distant, more formal, even at home. He did not mean harm, he simply did not know another way. The difference became visible even to outsiders. Diana carried the boys into crowds, holding them close, letting them wave. Charles stood slightly apart, smiling but not quite sinking into the moment. The press noticed, the public noticed, and the more the public noticed, the more the palace worried, because the story was shifting. The story was no longer just the crown. It was Diana and her children. And in that story, Charles sometimes looked like a supporting character in his own future. There were also these social circles. Diana's friends were not always the people the palace preferred. She liked lively company, people who laughed, people who talked about real things, not just horses and land and who was seated where. She began to lean toward friends who offered warmth without judgment, because warmth was what she was starving for. The palace preferred the old aristocratic circle, where everyone knew the rules and no one said too much. Diana found that circle suffocating. The people in it could be kind, but kindness in those circles often came with a ledger. You were expected to behave correctly in exchange. Diana did not want a ledger. She wanted love. Charles's circle remained steady, and at its center was Camilla. Charles did not treat Camilla as a temporary comfort. She watched for him, a constant. She understood his jokes. She shared his interests. She soothed him. She did not demand he become someone else. From the institution's perspective, this was manageable as long as it stayed discreet. From Diana's perspective, it was devastating. She began to confront the reality more directly. There were moments when she asked him about it. There were moments when she hinted. There were moments when she tried to force clarity, because ambiguity is a slow kind of torture. Charles responded as he often did. He minimized. He avoided. He turned the conversation into an argument about her emotions rather than his actions. This is an old tactic in unhappy marriages, and it is especially effective when one partner has been taught that emotional display is embarrassing. Diana, feeling unheard, became more volatile. Volatility, in a palace, is treated like a crime. The household began to worry not only about the marriage, but about Diana herself. She cried. She confronted. She demanded. She wanted to talk about feelings. Feelings were inconvenient. The palace was a place where people survived by pretending not to feel. Diana was a person who survived by feeling everything. She also began slowly to understand that the institution did not see her as a person first. It saw her as a role. The role could be celebrated. The role could be dressed. The role could be moved from place to place like a valuable item. But the role did not need to be comforted. This realization is the kind that changes you. Diana began to develop a sharper intelligence that was about the household. She paid attention to who reported to whom. She watched how information moved. She learned that there were people whose job was to protect the monarchy, not to protect her. She learned that private conversations did not stay private if they were useful to someone else. There were leaks, there were whispers, there were stories in the papers that sounded too specific to have been guessed. Diana started to suspect that even within her own walls, she was not safe. The staff, for their part, often felt whiplash. Diana could be warm and generous. She could also be demanding, emotionally intense, and unpredictable. That unpredictability terrified the professionals around her, because their entire purpose was predictability. If she changed her mind suddenly, they had to scramble. If she refused to follow advice, they had to manage the consequences. And sometimes she refused simply because she did not like being told what to do, a perfectly human reaction that becomes far less charming when it disrupts a state visit. Still, she was learning. She was learning how to use the rules rather than be used by them. She was learning how to charm people who needed charming, and how to ignore people who were trying to shrink her. When she walked into a room, she began to understand what the room did. She felt the shift. She felt people's attention. She felt the way a crowd leaned toward her like a field of flowers, turning to the sun. She learned to accept it rather than apologize for it. This acceptance did not make her happier at home. It made her stronger in public. By 1985, the monarchy was dealing with an uncomfortable dual reality. On the surface, Diana was a triumph. She brought glamour, youth, and a kind of emotional electricity that made the royal family feel relevant. She drew crowds, she generated goodwill. She turned charity work into something that made people open their wallets and their hearts. Privately, she was a storm inside the family. She did not always obey. She did not always hide her feelings. She did not always accept the idea that the institution came before her humanity. The fear inside the palace was not just that she might embarrass them, it was that she might change the rules without asking permission. In November 1985, Charles and Diana traveled to the United States for an official visit, including a glamorous evening at the White House. State dinners are theatre, and this was theatre at the highest level. The guests were powerful, the clothes were chosen carefully, the room itself seemed built for photographs. Diana arrived in a dark velvet gown, elegant and dramatic. It was the kind of dress that made you sit up straighter just looking at it. She was 24, young enough to seem like a dream and old enough now to carry herself with quiet authority. At one point, music played, and she was invited to dance with John Travolta. It should have been a harmless moment, a bit of charm for the evening. Instead, it became one of those cultural images that freezes in time. Diana moving across the floor with an American movie star, smiling in a way that looked both joyful and somehow hungry for joy, while cameras captured every angle. The next day it was everywhere. For the public, it was a thrill. For the palace, it was complicated, because a princess dancing with a celebrity should not matter to the stability of the monarchy, and yet it did. It mattered because it showed again what Diana was becoming. She was not merely royal, she was famous. The monarchy had always been famous, but it was a controlled fame contained within ritual and distance. Diana's fame was different. It was personal. It was modern. It was the kind of fame that could slip out of the institution's grasp and become its own empire. Charles saw the photographs. He saw the way the world reacted. He saw again that his wife was the headline. A man can endure many things when he believes he is the center of his own story. It is harder when he suspects he has become a supporting role. On the flight home there were smiles for the cameras, as always. In private, the temperature dropped. Diana, however, had tasted something on that trip that was both intoxicating and dangerous. Not just applause, she had had plenty of that. Something else. She had felt what it was like to be admired simply for being herself in a room full of power, to be treated as magnetic rather than managed. She also felt the sharp contrast when she returned to her own world, where the people closest to her treated her feelings as a problem to be solved, not as a truth to be honored. The marriage tightened further. Charles grew more irritable. Diana grew more restless. Their fights were no longer about small domestic issues. They were about identity, about whose needs mattered, about whether love could be negotiated at all. Diana began to sense that if she wanted to survive, she would need allies. Not just friends, but people who could help her navigate the machinery around her. She started to pay attention to press. She started to notice how stories formed. She started to understand that silence was not always protection. Sometimes silence was surrender. The palace, meanwhile, began to adjust its own thinking. It could not undo the marriage. It could not push her out. She was the mother of the heir and the spare, and she was beloved. So it did what institutions do when they cannot remove a problem. It tried to manage the problem. There were more meetings, more advice, more attempts to guide her into safe lanes. Some of this was reasonable. The world was changing. The press was becoming more aggressive. Private lives were no longer private. The monarchy needed caution. But caution, when delivered to someone already feeling trapped, sounds like another lock clicking into place. Diana began to push back more openly, though still mostly behind closed doors. She argued for her preferences. She demanded to be consulted. She resisted being treated like a decorative employee. She wanted a voice in how her life would be lived. And she did something else that was subtle but powerful. She began to show that she could win. When she wanted something and she pushed for it, she often got it. Sometimes because she was right. Sometimes because the household feared the consequences of denying her. Sometimes because her popularity made resistance feel risky. The courtiers noticed. The older royals noticed. Charles noticed most of all. This was the shift that truly frightened the palace. Diana was no longer just reacting, she was learning the game. She was also, in the quiet spaces between public events, beginning to face her own loneliness in ways she could not admit out loud. She had everything people dream about, and she felt empty. That emptiness made her vulnerable to the wrong comforts. It also made her brave in a strange way, because when you already feel you have nothing emotionally safe to lose, you are more willing to take risks. By the end of 1985, the image of the royal family looked secure. 2 beautiful boys, a glamorous princess, a serious heir. Smiles at events, handshakes at ceremonies, polite headlines. But beneath that image, the lines were hardening. The marriage was becoming less a partnership and more a contest of survival. Diana was no longer simply trying to be loved. She was trying to be heard. And the institution around her, built to survive centuries, was beginning to realize that the most dangerous person in a palace is not someone who storms the gates. It is someone who learns where the doors are, and then stops asking permission to open them. It is someone who learns where the doors are, and then stops asking permission to open them. In the spring of 1986, Diana was still young enough to be called a girl by people who liked to feel older than her, but she was no longer naive. She had 2 sons, a title that could not be peeled off, and a marriage that had stopped pretending it was warm. She also had something far more intoxicating than marital comfort, proof that she could move the public like weather. The palace responded to that proof the way it responded to everything unpredictable. It tried to turn it into routine. It tightened schedules, polished the message, and placed more people between Diana and her own instincts. The unspoken plan was simple. If she was going to be powerful, she would be powerful in the approved direction. Diana smiled at the plan and then lived around it. That year began with travel. The kind of travel that looks glamorous to outsiders and feels like an endurance test to the person doing it. There were official visits stacked close together, each one carrying the weight of diplomacy and the practical burden of being photographed from every angle. In April and May, Charles and Diana traveled through Canada and then on to Japan. The calendar read like a list of responsibilities. Diana read it like a list of chances to breathe. Canada had crowds and flags and the slightly windblown energy of a country that could be formal without taking itself too seriously. Then Japan in May 1986 brought a different kind of attention. Japan was orderly, elegant, and intensely curious. When they arrived in Kyoto, Diana stepped into a world that watched her with a fascination that was almost artistic. There were tea ceremonies, gardens, temples, and careful conversations where every gesture mattered. She was good at it, and good in a way that unsettled the professionals around her. Diana had the rare ability to look respectful without looking stiff. She could sit through formalities and still make the moment feel personal. When she wore clothing that nodded to the culture without turning it into costume, people noticed. When she spoke softly but with genuine interest, people leaned in. And once again, it was not Charles who became the story. The press followed her face the way a compass follows north. Even in places where protocol was strict, the cameras found her. In Japan, where politeness can be a kind of armor, she still broke through. The public response was intense. People called it Diana fever, and it was not said as a joke. It was said the way you describe something that spreads. Charles watched, aides watched, and somewhere in the machinery of the royal household, a quiet calculation sharpened. Diana did not merely represent the monarchy, she was becoming its most marketable emotion. Back in Britain, the machinery returned to its familiar grind. The boys were growing. William was a child with a future already wrapped around him. Harry was still small, still the spare, in a world that used that word with a straight face. Diana tried to give them something simple, even if simplicity in her life now meant choosing which of three kinds of security to bring to the playground. She was also learning that royal life had a strange rule about suffering. If you suffered quietly, it was considered dignity. If you suffered visibly, it was considered misbehavior. Diana did not suffer quietly. She had moments of brightness. She was not only pain, but the pain was there, threaded through everything. She still fought the illness that made her feel briefly in control of her own body. She still felt lonely in her own marriage. She still felt watched inside her own home. And she still had an appetite for love that did not come with conditions. It was in that atmosphere that she began taking riding lessons. On paper, this looked harmless. Diana had grown up around horses. Riding fit the image, aristocratic, healthy, suitably outdoorsy. The palace liked anything that suggested wholesome tradition, preferably in a photograph where everyone's hair stayed in place. The instructor was Major James Hewitt, a cavalry officer, confident, attentive, and very good at the one thing Diana had been starved of. He focused on her. Hewitt was not a prince, and that was part of the appeal. He did not carry the cold weight of an institution. He did not treat her emotions like an inconvenience. He talked to her as if she were a woman, not a role. He made her feel chosen in a private way, not as a public symbol. It is easy to reduce an affair to gossip, but if you want to understand what terrified the palace, you have to understand why it happened. Diana was not hunting scandal. She was looking for shelter. She was looking for tenderness that did not require her to be perfect at it. The relationship deepened. It moved from lessons into something more personal. The kind of closeness that grows in the gaps of a marriage where both partners have stopped reaching. Diana later acknowledged it plainly. By the time she did, the truth had already become part of the public imagination, but in those earlier years it was still mostly a private risk. And that risk was exactly what made the palace sweat. A royal marriage can survive many private disappointments, but it struggles with stories. Stories leak. Stories grew teeth. A woman like Diana, adored by the public, became a special kind of danger if she also became a woman with secrets. Diana, ironically, did not begin this period feeling powerful in her private life. She felt more vulnerable than ever. But vulnerability can sharpen a person's instincts. She began to make decisions with a new bluntness. She began to choose what mattered to her, not just what made the household comfortable. If she could not get intimacy at home, she would put intimacy into her work. In 1987, that choice led her straight into a subject that made many people look away. By the mid to late 80s, fear around acquired immune deficiency syndrome had spread faster than facts. People whispered about it. People treated those affected as if they were contagious through air, touch, or simple proximity. Patients were avoided. Families sometimes hid them. Hospitals fought stigma as much as illness. Diana did not like stigma. She had lived with a quieter version of it herself, the feeling of being judged, labeled, managed, spoken about in rooms you were not allowed to enter. She recognized that same lonely shame in others, and it made her furious. On April 9, 1987, she went to Middlesex Hospital in London to open a ward for patients with human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The staff explained the basics, and the palace, always cautious, would have preferred a neat photo with distance and gloves, and no surprises. Diana did not do neat distance. She walked in, she spoke to patients, and she shook hands without gloves. She did it calmly, not as a stunt, not as a rebellion performed with a wink, but as a simple human gesture that said, "You are not untouchable." The photograph flew around the world. It did what speeches and pamphlets rarely managed to do. It made the truth easy to feel. You could not catch the disease from a handshake. You could, however, catch humanity from one. The public reacted. Some were moved, some were shocked. Some were suddenly forced to admit they had been afraid of a person they had never met. Hospitals and charities felt the impact almost immediately. Conversation shifted. The stigma did not disappear, but a crack appeared in it, and through that crack came light. Inside the palace, the reaction was more complicated. A humanitarian triumph is still frightening when it is unscheduled. Diana had taken a subject that many people preferred to keep hidden and dragged it into the open with one gesture. She had done it without asking permission in the only way the institution truly respected, by making the act unignorable. She had turned her own body into a message, her hand into a headline. The palace understood headlines. They also understood that Diana was now capable of using headlines like weapons, even if she did not think of them as weapons. She was changing public behavior. She was altering how people saw illness, shame, and compassion. That is influence, and influence in a monarchy is meant to flow upward, not sideways. Charles, for his part, had his own feelings about it. He was not indifferent to charity work. He had always cared about causes, but his way of caring was intellectual, structured, often tied to committees and reports and long-term planning. Diana's way was visceral. She made people feel something immediately. She made them donate because their hearts were squeezed, not because they respected a proposal. Both approaches had value. Only one turned her into an icon. This difference began to create a new kind of coldness at home, not a dramatic shouting match, but a steady irritation that settled into the corners of their life. Charles wanted order. Diana wanted meaning. Charles wanted dignity. Diana wanted connection. The more she went toward connection in public, the more she felt the lack of it in private. She also learned something else in 1987. She learned that the palace could not fully control her image, even when it tried. That year, she attended a concert at Wembley Stadium. It was a simple pleasure, music, cheering, a place where she could sit in the dark for a while and not have to be perfect. The problem was that nothing was simple when you were her. Cameras appeared, rumors appeared, people started to connect dots that may not even have been dots. The palace did what it usually did when threatened by a photograph. It tried to stop it. It was not that the palace feared a picture of Diana with a famous musician. It feared what pictures suggest, what they inspire people to imagine, what they tempt editors to print on a front page with a question mark that might as well be a knife. Diana noticed these attempts. She noticed what the institution panicked over. She noticed what it tried to hide, and she began to store that knowledge. Meanwhile, the situation with Hewitt carried on, partly hidden, partly sensed. People around Diana were not blind. Staff see everything. They hear footsteps at strange hours. They notice when moods lift after certain phone calls. They notice when someone begins to dress a little differently, to stand a little taller, to seem briefly less lonely. Some staff sympathized. Some disapproved. Some felt anxious because their job was to prevent exactly this kind of risk. Diana herself was living inside a contradiction. She was becoming more influential, more sure of her public voice, while privately she was still aching. The relationship offered comfort, but it also offered dependence, and dependence is never truly safe. She wanted love that could not betray her. She was choosing a love that could easily become a story. The palace began to respond, not only by trying to guide her, but by reorganizing around her. It is a subtle thing, but important. They began to treat her less like a family member and more like a separate political unit. There were officers, staff, private secretaries. There were the people who worked for Charles and the people who worked for Diana, sometimes in the same building, sometimes in different wings, sometimes in quiet competition. This is how court life works. It rarely looks like open warfare. It looks like diaries that do not align. It looks like memos sent to the wrong place on purpose. It looks like a dress fitting that happens without informing someone who wanted to control the wardrobe. It looks like a phone call not returned until it is too late to matter. The boys, still young, lived in the middle of this. Diana fought for their normality with a kind of ferocious tenderness. She took them to amusement parks. She took them to fast food places. She tried to do the sort of ordinary things that would make their memories feel like childhood rather than training. This was not always welcomed. Some courtiers thought it undignified. Diana did not care. She cared about the boys' inner lives more than she cared about looking immaculate. To many in the palace, that alone was unsettling. Royal children were meant to be shaped. Diana was shaping them in her own image, and her image was emotional, modern, and stubbornly human. In 1988, the separation between Charles and Diana became more visible to those who lived close enough to feel it. They still appeared together. They still did tours and ceremonies, they still played the roles, but in private they were often living parallel lives. Charles retreated into his friendships and his interests, and increasingly into the comfort he found with Camilla. Diana retreated into her children, her work, and the small circle of people who felt loyal to her personally, not to the institution. That year, her household grew more professional, more prepared to handle the constant media attention. She had learned that being naive with the press was like leaving the door open in a storm. She could not stop the wind, but she could at least decide where to stand. She also began to choose her patronages with more intent. She was no longer content to be the smiling face for safe charities. She wanted to walk into rooms where people were uncomfortable, because discomfort was often where the truth lived. She visited hospitals more. She visited children's charities more. She listened to people who had been ignored, and she made them feel valued simply by staying long enough for their stories to finish. Every time she did this, the public love deepened. Every time the public love deepened, the palace's anxiety sharpened. Because the palace knew something that the crowd did not always understand. Popularity is not the same as security. Popularity can turn quickly. Popularity can become expectation. And expectation placed on a royal can become a trap. But Diana did not behave like someone frightened of a trap. She behaved like someone who was already in one and was testing the bars. By 1989, the marriage was no longer simply unhappy. It was brittle. There were dinner parties where the conversation stayed polite and thin. There were weekends at country estates where Diana felt like a guest again, not a wife. There were occasions where she sensed, with a stab of humiliation, that Camilla was not just a rumor in the background, but a presence in the wider circle, acknowledged in subtle ways. Protected by people who believed Charles's comfort mattered more than Diana's pain. Diana began to confront this reality more openly with those she trusted. She also began carefully to show that she would not be shamed into silence forever. In November 1989, she traveled to Indonesia. It was an overseas visit that carried the usual official duties, but Diana's mind was on something else. She wanted to go to Sitanala Leprosy Hospital near Jakarta. Leprosy, like AIDS, carried stigma far beyond its medical reality. People feared it as if it were a curse. Patients were sometimes isolated, treated as if their very touch could ruin you. The disease had become wrapped in centuries of misunderstanding and moral judgment. Diana understood what moral judgment felt like. She also understood that the fastest way to break fear was often the simplest gesture. Officials advised caution. There were always officials advising caution. Diana listened, and then she went anyway. At the hospital she sat with patients. She spoke with them, and she touched them. She shook hands. She did it calmly, again without drama, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to treat someone with a stigmatized disease like a person. The images travelled fast. The message landed with force. A princess could touch these patients, and nothing terrible happened. The terrible thing, Diana was quietly pointing out, was how society had treated them before she arrived. The world responded. Charities received attention. Conversations shifted. Some people felt braver about volunteering or donating, or simply not recoiling. The palace watched all of this with a complicated mix of pride and dread. Pride because she was doing genuine good, dread because she was doing it in a way that made her bigger than the institution's preferred boundaries. And there was another layer of dread that no one wanted to say out loud. Diana was now building a public identity that belonged to her alone. She was not merely the Princess of Wales as a function of being married to Charles. She was the Princess of Wales as a moral voice, as a figure with her own mission, her own instincts, her own direct relationship with the public. That direct relationship was the palace's deepest fear. The monarchy depends on a kind of emotional agreement with the public. You will admire us from a respectful distance, and we will provide continuity and ceremony and the feeling that the nation has a spine. Diana was turning that agreement into something more intimate. She was making people feel as if she belonged to them, not to the crown. Meanwhile, her private life was becoming more precarious. The relationship with Hewitt, whatever comfort it offered, existed under the shadow of exposure. Diana was not careless, but she was also not invisible. Nothing she did was invisible. The press followed her constantly. The staff around her were numerous. The number of people who could notice something, suspect something, whisper something, was always large. And the palace knew that if this story broke, it would not land like an ordinary affair. It would land like a crack in the fairy tale. The public would feel betrayed. And betrayal is a dangerous emotion in a country that funds your lifestyle. Diana herself understood this too, which made the whole situation more tense. She wanted love, and she also wanted to protect her children. She wanted to be seen, and she also feared being judged. She lived in a constant state of balancing, keeping her heart alive while keeping her life from collapsing. Charles, on his side, continued his own pattern. He presented duty in public. He sought comfort privately. He did not, at this stage, publicly acknowledge the truth of his emotional life, because the monarchy does not reward honesty that causes trouble. So the couple moved forward like two people on the same stage, playing different plays. The Queen, watching from her position at the centre of the institution, had her own dilemma. She was not a sentimental person in the public sense, but she understood family, duty, and the danger of public drama. She also understood that Diana was the mother of a future king, and that fact made her untouchable in certain ways. You could not simply correct her like a misbehaving employee. You could not simply send her away. The sons made sure of that. In private, there were conversations. There were attempts to smooth things. There were the quiet interventions that royal families prefer, the kind that never reach the papers, because the papers are treated like a fire that must never be fed. But the fire was already burning outside. The late 80s were the years when tabloid culture grew more aggressive, more hungry, more willing to print rumors as if rumors were evidence. Diana could not avoid it. If she did not read the papers, someone would tell her what they said. If she tried to ignore it, she would still feel it in the way people looked at her at events, in the way questions were asked, in the way photographers shouted her name like they owned it. There were even periods when those around her tried to control what she saw, as if limiting information could limit pain. It did not. It simply made her feel more trapped. Diana wanted to know what was being said about her. Knowledge, even ugly knowledge, felt better than being blindsided. By the end of 1989, the palace was facing a reality it could no longer pretend was temporary. Diana was not settling into her role, she was reshaping it. She was also becoming emotionally tougher, though not in the way the palace preferred. The palace wanted her to become stoic. Diana was becoming strategic. She had learned that affection could be mobilized. She had learned that a gesture could change a national conversation. She had learned that if she chose the right moment, she could make the world look where she wanted it to look. This is why the palace was frightened. Because in a system built on hierarchy, the most destabilizing person is not the one who breaks the rules loudly. It is the one who follows the rules just enough to stay inside the room, and then quietly rearranges the furniture while everyone else is still pretending. The room belongs to them. And now the furniture was shifting, the chairs of loyalty and secrecy and tradition were creaking. The marriage was no longer a private sadness, it was becoming a fault line. The boys were growing up watching two separate worlds inside one family. The press was circling closer. Diana could feel the walls tightening, but she could also feel something else, something that kept her walking forward. She could feel the public at her back. And that meant that whatever came next, it would not stay hidden behind palace doors. And that meant that whatever came next, it would not stay hidden behind palace doors. The doors, however, were still doing their best. In 1990, the palace settled into a new kind of routine, the routine of a marriage that no longer pretended to be close. On paper, Charles and Diana were still a team. The Prince and Princess of Wales, the future of the monarchy, the handsome heir and the dazzling mother of his sons. In real life, they were two separate planets, orbiting the same sun and sharing the same children, but pulling in different directions. A court formed around Charles, steady, traditional, filled with men and women who believed the greatest sin was surprise. Another court formed around Diana, more emotional, more protective, and far more suspicious. These were not official courts with banners and trumpets. They were groups of staff and friends, people who controlled diaries, access, and whispers. A monarchy is not just crowns and carriages, it is information. Who knows what, when they know it, and how they use it. Diana had learned that the hard way. She had learned it when a private feeling appeared in print, as if a reporter had been sitting at the foot of her bed. She had learned it when a harmless outing became a story with a sharp edge. She had learned it when she realized that some of the people smiling at her in the corridor might be carrying her life to someone else in a folder. Once you suspect you are being watched, you start watching back. She began to treat her own household like a map. She noticed which staff members were warm, which were dutiful, which were hungry for influence. She noticed who came to her with warnings and who came to her with advice that sounded like instruction. She noticed who seemed too interested in her mood, not because they cared, but because they wanted to report it. This was not paranoia. It was palace literacy. Charles, on the other side of the building, had his own version of this. He did not see himself as scheming. He saw himself as trying to keep a life from collapsing, while everyone insisted it had to look perfect. He leaned harder on the people who made him feel understood. He leaned harder on the circle that treated his interests as serious, his complaints as reasonable, his irritations as proof that he was carrying too much. And at the center of that comfort sat Camilla, still not on the balcony, still not in the photographs, but always in the emotional room. Diana did not need a detective to know where Charles's heart went when he was tired. She could feel it in the way he relaxed when he spoke about certain friends. She could feel it in the way he tensed when she wanted affection. She could feel it in the way his patience ran out quickly when the conversation turned to her pain. She tried repeatedly to talk, not to accuse, not to perform, but to understand what she was living inside. Charles responded with a familiar pattern, which was to treat any deep emotional conversation as an attack. He would become defensive, then distant, then busy. If he could not solve it in one calm sentence, he preferred to leave it unsolved. Diana did not know how to leave it unsolved. An unsolved pain does not sit quietly in the corner. It follows you. So she put her energy where it could move. She put it into her sons and into public work that felt like it mattered. William was growing into a boy with a serious destiny. He was old enough now to sense tension, even if no one explained it. Children do not need formal briefings to know when a room is cold. They feel it. Diana tried to keep his world warm anyway. She leaned into routines that looked ordinary, because ordinary can be protective. She packed school bags. She showed up at the school gate when she could, which required planning and security, and still sometimes a crowd. When William moved on to a new school, Diana pushed hard to be involved, not as a ceremonial visitor, but as a mother. She wanted to be the one walking him to the door, not a footnote in a press release. The palace did not love this. Royal children had historically been delivered into institutions like little officers reporting for duty. Diana treated it like a normal mother's moment, one that mattered because it mattered to her son. Harry was younger and wilder, the kind of child who ran toward noise and laughter. Diana adored that spirit. She encouraged it, even when it made people frown. In that family, the heir is trained to be careful. The spare often gets labeled as trouble. Diana wanted Harry to be seen as a person, not a spare. She also wanted them both to understand that life did not happen only inside palaces and schools. She took them to places where children were not expected to go. Amusement parks, simple restaurants, the kind of outings that would be forgettable if she were anyone else. With her, nothing was forgettable. The press could turn a trip for burgers into a debate about dignity. Diana did not care, or rather, she cared, but she cared more about her sons having memories that did not feel like training. Her charity work became sharper and more personal. She had already taken on stigma in hospitals, and now she began to notice another kind of suffering. Quieter, but everywhere. Homelessness, families broken by addiction, women trapped in violent relationships, children bruised in ways that had nothing to do with falling off a bicycle. She visited shelters. She sat with people who had been ignored. She listened. She touched their hands the way she had touched the hands of patients. She did not speak to them like a princess delivering comfort from a safe distance. She spoke like someone who recognized what it felt like to be powerless in a room full of powerful people. This was part of her gift and part of her danger. She did not just do good works, she made suffering visible. The palace liked good works that stayed tidy. Diana was making a habit of pulling the curtains back. By now it was impossible to ignore how the public responded to her. Crowds showed up for her. They brought her gifts. They cried when they saw her. They shouted her name as if it were a promise. Inside the palace, aides began to speak about her not just as the Princess of Wales, but as an independent phenomenon, the Diana factor. That factor complicated everything. It complicated security, because crowds behave differently when they feel personal devotion. It complicated scheduling because she could not move through a space without it becoming an event. It complicated Charles's position because the man, born to be king, was often treated like the opening act to his wife's presence. It also complicated the Queen's careful balancing act. The Queen understood popularity, but she had never needed it the way Diana seemed to create it. The Queen's authority came from continuity. Diana's came from emotion. Both were forms of power. One could be controlled by tradition, the other could not. In this atmosphere, Diana did something that was both brave and frightening. She confronted the truth. It happened at a party, one of those glossy gatherings where people laugh lightly while measuring each other. Diana had walked into a room where Camilla was present, and she felt a familiar pressure in her chest. Not jealousy alone, though there was jealousy, but humiliation. The humiliation of knowing the story everyone else was politely pretending not to know. Diana moved through the room with the confidence she had learned in public, the confidence that says, "I belong here, even if my heart is pounding." She found Camilla, pulled her aside, and spoke with a directness that made the air tighten. The words have been repeated so often, they have almost become folklore, but the essence is clear. Diana told Camilla she knew what was going on. She told her she understood the role she was playing in her marriage. Camilla, by temperament, did not panic easily. She listened, and then, with a coolness that could almost be mistaken for kindness, she pointed out what Diana had on paper. The title, the public love, the children. She asked in a tone that implied the answer was obvious, what more Diana could possibly want. Diana's answer in her mind, if not in that exact moment, was simple. She wanted her husband. She wanted love that belonged to her. She wanted the basic dignity of not being cheated on while the world applauded her smile. You can have jewels and crowds and palaces and still want the one thing you cannot buy. After that confrontation, something in Diana shifted. She stopped telling herself the story that maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe it would settle with time. She knew she could not unknow it. For a while, she tried to live with it anyway. She tried to hold her family together like someone holding a cracked vase, careful not to move too fast because it might shatter. But the crack was spreading. Her relationship with James Hewitt, which had offered her comfort, also began to change. He had a military career, obligations that pulled him away. During the Gulf Crisis and the Gulf War, he was deployed and then involved in duties that made their contact harder. The distance mattered. Diana felt it like abandonment, even if it was not meant as abandonment. The relationship had given her warmth, and it had also given her dependence. When the warmth faded, the emptiness rushed back in. She was still adored in public. She was still lonely in private. It is hard to explain to someone who has never lived it how lonely it can feel to be loved by millions and not held by the person in the room. The palace saw the strain and attempted its usual remedy: discipline, more structure, more advice, more supervision. It began to restrict who Diana could have around her. It suggested which friends were suitable. It favored people who were loyal to the institution first. Diana resisted. She wanted loyalty to her. This resistance created new conflicts with staff. Diaries became battlefields. One side would book an engagement, the other would raise objections. Press offices began to brief journalists in ways that were subtle enough to deny and sharp enough to wound. A story would appear about Diana being difficult, moody, unstable. Another would appear suggesting Charles was cold, old-fashioned, out of touch. None of these stories were entirely invented. That is what made them potent. The public started to sense what the palace had been trying to hide. The marriage was not a fairy tale anymore. It was something else, something closer to a long, polite argument carried out in public. By 1991, the pressure on the monarchy was growing for reasons beyond Diana. The world was changing. The press was more aggressive. Public patience for privilege was thinning. Politicians came and went. The economy shifted. People were less inclined to bow emotionally just because tradition asked them to. In a changing world, Diana looked modern, and that made the institution both grateful and nervous. She was its bridge to the present, and she was also a person who might walk across that bridge without waiting for the family behind her. That year she began to seek more help for herself in quieter ways. She talked to people she trusted about her mental health. She tried to understand her own patterns of pain, the way rejection triggered desperation, the way pressure made her body feel like an enemy. She began to grasp that the illness she had battled was not a personality flaw. It was a symptom of a life that felt unlivable. This understanding did not make her life easier overnight. It did, however, give her something crucial: language. When you can name what is happening, you can start to fight it. Diana also began to speak more frankly with her closest circle, not just about her marriage, but about the monarchy itself. She had once believed the institution would become her family. Now she saw that it was a system built to survive, not to nurture. It would protect the crown even if it broke the people carrying it. She was one of those people. She had carried it beautifully. She was tired of being broken quietly. There were moments in 1991 when the family tried to pull together. Public appearances where they smiled more warmly. Private weekends where everyone pretended the tension could be soothed by fresh air and proper meals. Sometimes it almost worked, because human beings can slip into the comfort of familiarity even when they are hurting each other. But the deeper issue remained. Charles and Diana were not just incompatible. They were living two different definitions of love. Charles's definition was companionship that did not demand vulnerability. Diana's definition was vulnerability shared. When a man avoids vulnerability, a woman who needs it will feel starved. When a woman asks for emotional closeness with urgency, a man who fears it will feel attacked. Each then becomes the other's nightmare without intending to. Their sons, watching, absorbed their own lessons. William began to show the sensitivity of a child who notices too much. He was bright, polite, and often solemn in a way that suggested he was storing more than he said. Diana worried about that. She wanted him to be able to feel without carrying the weight of the monarchy in his chest. Harry reacted differently. He became more playful, more mischievous, as if laughter could push the tension away. Diana loved that too, and she also knew that one day the laughter might turn into anger if the family did not change. Diana's relationship with the press was also changing. She had once experienced the press as a predator and a mirror. Now she began to see it as a tool, dangerous but powerful. If the press could hurt her, it could also protect her, if she learned how to use it. She did not do this with a cold smile and a plan written on paper. She did it with the instincts of someone who had been cornered. When you are cornered, you start looking for openings. The opening she found was simple. If she could not get truth and support inside the palace, she could shape the truth outside it. That idea would terrify the palace more than anything because it struck at the heart of the institution. The monarchy depended on the family keeping its mess behind the curtain. If the curtain lifted, the public would see not continuity and dignity, but ordinary human chaos wearing expensive clothes. And Diana, beloved by the public, would be the most credible person to lift it. In 1992, the year that would later be described as an especially painful one for the royal family, the strain finally broke through in a way that could not be fully patched. It began with the usual signs: more stories in the papers, more whispered commentary, more photographers outside her gates, more questions shouted at her as she walked to a car. Diana started to look thinner again. Her eyes sometimes had that faraway intensity that comes when someone is surviving one day at a time, and yet, on engagements, she could still turn the air warm. She could still make a nurse laugh. She could still hold a dying person's hand without flinching. She could still move a crowd. This contrast between the fragile private woman and the radiant public figure made her even more fascinating. It also made her feel divided. People were in love with the part of her that performed strength. Very few people were allowed to see the part of her that could barely breathe. Around her, the household machinery grew more frantic. Staff changed, allegiances shifted, people were hired and dismissed. Some left because they were exhausted. Some were pushed out because they were seen as loyal to the wrong side. Every change created more leaks. Every leak created more mistrust. Every mistrust created more changes. The marriage, by now, was not merely unhappy. It was a subject of national curiosity. People who had once bought souvenir mugs now read the papers with a slightly guilty hunger, as if watching a neighbor's marriage fall apart through the window. Charles and Diana continued to appear together, but their togetherness had a brittle quality. The smiles came a beat late. The body language stayed careful. The public began to read the space between them like a sentence. The Queen tried to hold the family together because that was her job in a deeper sense. She had held the monarchy through war, political change, and cultural shifts. She did not want to be the monarch whose heir's marriage collapsed into public spectacle. But the Queen was also limited. She could advise, she could encourage, she could insist on certain duties. She could not manufacture love between two people who no longer trusted each other. Diana, sensing the limitation, turned inward and outward at the same time. Inward to her closest confidants. Outward to the public, through her work and through the aura she carried. She was starting to accept a truth that would have shattered her at 20. She could not make Charles love her the way she needed, but she could still decide what kind of life she would live within the walls. And then she met someone who offered her a different kind of possibility. Andrew Morton was a journalist and author who, like many people in his world, understood that royal biographies sold. Not just because people liked crowns, but because people liked secrets. He began to work on a book about Diana, and at first it might have seemed like just another biography in a market full of them. But this book was different from the beginning, because it was built from the one thing the palace could not tolerate: a voice. At first the contact was indirect, through friends, through quiet conversations, through the kind of careful steps taken when everyone knows the walls have ears. Diana did not sit down openly with a journalist in a formal interview. That would have been too obvious, too easy to stop. Instead, information flowed in a way that could be denied, which is how all palace warfare prefers to operate. She began to feed her truth into the world in a way that made the institution feel something close to panic, though panic in those buildings is usually expressed as a firm request and a closed door. There were conversations about what could be published. There were warnings about consequences. There were attempts to locate the source, who was talking, who was leaking, who was betraying whom. The household searched for the leak like a person searching for a smell of smoke, hoping to find the match before it reached the curtains. Diana understood that if she was going to do this, she would have to be careful. She also understood that careful did not mean silent. In a private room away from most of the staff, she began to speak her story aloud, not in polished statements, not in royal language, in plain human sentences. She talked about loneliness, she talked about illness, she talked about her marriage, about the feeling of being young and adored and still utterly unloved in the place that was supposed to be home. She talked about the moments that had scared her and the moments that had made her feel invisible. She talked about what it was like to be watched by the world and dismissed by the man beside her. She talked about the pressure of being a symbol when you are still a person. And to capture that story so it could travel safely through the maze of intermediaries, a small machine became her accomplice. A tape recorder. The click of the button was quiet, almost ordinary. But the meaning of it was enormous. It meant she was no longer relying on anyone else to interpret her feelings. She was no longer trusting the palace to speak for her. She was speaking for herself in a way that could not be softened by courtiers or corrected by protocol. In those rooms, the palace had always believed it controlled the narrative. It controlled access, it controlled ceremony, it controlled silence. Now Diana was recording the thing silence was designed to protect. And once a truth is recorded, it has a habit of finding its way out. And once a truth is recorded, it has a habit of finding its way out. The tapes were made in stolen pockets of time the way fragile things often are. A few minutes here, half an hour there, in rooms where the curtains were thick and the doors were closed, just enough to suggest privacy. Though privacy in a palace is mostly a rumour with good posture. Diana would sit alone, press the button, and speak into the silence, as if she were speaking to one person who might finally listen without flinching. Her voice on those recordings was not grand. It was plain, sometimes shaky, sometimes firm, sometimes so matter-of-fact, it was almost startling. She talked about her childhood, she talked about the loneliness inside the marriage. She talked about the illness she had hidden, and the despair that had once driven her to throw herself down the stairs while pregnant, not because she wanted to die, but because she wanted the pain to be seen. She also talked about the thing everyone pretended not to know, the third person in her marriage, always nearby even when not present. Diana did not say it with the theatrical fury people expected from a wronged princess. She said it with the tired clarity of someone who has lived in an emotional fog for years and is finally naming the furniture. The recordings moved through intermediaries, passed hand to hand like contraband. It was all very careful, very quiet, very much like the sort of operation the palace assumed it alone could run. The difference was that this operation was running inside the palace, powered by the person it was meant to contain. When Andrew Morton's book was published in 1992, it landed like a tray dropped in a cathedral. The sound echoed. Diana, her true story, did not read like the usual royal biography, heavy on polite dates and flattering adjectives. It read like a confession that had slipped out of a locked drawer. It described bulimia, self-harm, despair, and a marriage that looked less like a fairy tale and more like two people trapped in a public contract. The palace's first instinct was to deny. Denial was always the first instinct. The official line was that the book was full of inaccuracies, that it was sensational, that it was unkind. Friends of the family briefed journalists. Courtiers frowned in that precise way courtiers have, the expression that says, "How terribly vulgar," while also thinking, "How terribly dangerous." The problem was that the public recognized the shape of truth in it. Not every detail could be verified, but the emotion rang true. People had seen Diana's eyes. They had seen the way her smile sometimes looked like effort. They had seen the way she clung to her children as if they were oxygen, and now they had a story that explained the cracks. Inside the palace, the fear was not only about the book, it was about what the book represented. Someone close to Diana had spoken. Someone had given her side, not in a carefully managed statement, but in raw human detail. The palace could survive criticism. It could even survive scandal if it was controlled. What it could not tolerate was losing control of the voice. The household began searching for the source with quiet fury. Staff were questioned, friends were watched, phones were treated like potential enemies. Diana, who had always suspected the walls had ears, now watched as the walls began to twitch. At the same time, she felt something new, something close to relief. Not because she enjoyed the chaos, she did not, but because she was no longer carrying the truth alone. The story was out. People could see her pain, and once people saw it, they could not easily be told it did not exist. For Charles, the book was humiliating, not simply because it revealed marital problems, but because it positioned Diana as the wounded heroine and him as the cold man who failed her. He did not see himself that way. He saw himself as a man burdened by duty, trapped in an unhappy match, trying to keep the institution steady. In his mind, there were two sufferers, not one. Charles's allies moved quickly to counter the narrative. stories appeared that painted Diana as unstable, manipulative, too emotional. If the public was going to sympathize with her, the palace wanted that sympathy trimmed down to a manageable size. Diana watched the counterattack and learned a hard lesson. The institution did not respond to her pain with care, it responded with strategy. The year 1992 was already heavy for the royal family even before Morton's book. It was a year when the broader family story began to fray in public. Other royal marriages were breaking down, and each breakdown chipped away at the monarchy's image of stability. The Queen later called it her annus horribilis, her horrible year, and it was an unusually candid phrase from a woman who treated understatement like a family heirloom. For Diana, 1992 was the year the curtain began to lift, whether anyone wanted it lifted or not. In the summer, another kind of leak exploded into public view. Private phone calls, intimate and embarrassing, became tabloid fodder. One involved Diana, a recording of her talking to a man with whom she seemed emotionally entangled. The press nicknamed it in a way that sounded playful and was not. Another involved Charles and Camilla, a call that revealed their closeness in a way no palace denial could polish. The tone of those recordings was so private that reading about them felt like overhearing something you were not supposed to hear. People were fascinated. People were horrified. People bought papers as if they were buying permission to stare. These leaks mattered because they changed the public's posture. A royal affair had always been rumored, whispered, treated as something that happened in a distant world. Now it had sound, it had words, it had awkward intimacy. The glamour evaporated and left behind something ordinary and messy. Inside the palace, this was the nightmare. Not just scandal, but detail. By the end of 1992, the Queen could no longer pretend the situation would calm on its own. The marriage between Charles and Diana was poisoning everything around it, and the public could smell it. In December, Prime Minister John Major announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales would separate. Monarchy depends on mystery. Detail is the enemy of mystery. The statement was carefully written, as these things always are. It emphasized continued duty, continued commitment to the children, continued respect. It tried to make separation sound like a calm administrative adjustment, like moving a meeting to a different room. The public did not experience it as calm. The public experienced it as the end of the fairy tale it had paid emotional money to believe in. Diana's feelings were complicated. Separation meant loss, and she had never been someone who handled loss with neat acceptance. But it also meant freedom, at least a kind of freedom. It meant she no longer had to perform marriage in the same house with a man who made her feel alone. It meant she could stop trying to win love that was not being offered. It also meant that the palace had a new problem. Diana was no longer merely an unhappy wife inside the system. She was a separated princess with her own popularity, her own public identity, and now potentially her own agenda. Separation did not remove her from public life. In some ways, it intensified her. She began to shape her work more deliberately. She continued with hospitals, with children, with people living in the shadow of stigma. She also began to turn more toward mental health and the invisible wounds of trauma because she understood them intimately. But she was also exhausted. The press was relentless. More so now because separation made her seem available. Available for gossip, available for romance, available for scrutiny. Photographers hunted her like sport. They waited outside gates, they followed cars. They shouted questions that were designed not to be answered, but to be captured in a photograph of her expression. If you want to understand why she terrified the palace, picture this moment. A woman who had been controlled by the institution for a decade suddenly had less reason to cooperate. She still needed to protect her sons. She still needed to maintain certain duties, but she no longer needed to protect the illusion of a happy marriage. The institution's most useful symbol had become its most unpredictable variable. In 1993, Diana tried to find a way to breathe. She made changes to her staff, trying to create a circle she could trust. Trust was now her obsession, because betrayal had become routine. She also tried to put boundaries around the press, though boundaries against the press are like umbrellas in a hurricane. They can help for a moment, but the wind always finds a way. The palace had its own plan. It wanted Diana to fade and not disappear completely. That would be impossible, but fade into a quieter corner of royal life where she would not dominate headlines. It encouraged her to reduce public engagements. It suggested she take time. It suggested she be careful. Diana heard the message underneath the suggestion. Be quiet. She did not want to be quiet, but she did want peace. So she tried something that surprised people. In late 1993, she announced she would withdraw from public life for a time. It was framed as a need for rest, a wish to focus on her children, a pause. The palace exhaled. Some courtiers likely believed the problem was being solved. If Diana stepped back, the temperature might drop. The headlines might soften. Charles might resume center stage. But Diana stepping back did not erase Diana. It made her absence loud. The public missed her, charities missed her, and the press, deprived of fresh photographs of her shaking hands, became hungrier for any scrap of her private life. If she would not provide the story through engagements, they would hunt it in parking lots and restaurants and friends' homes. Meanwhile, Charles began to shift more openly toward rehabilitation of his own image. He continued his work, continued his speeches, continued his courses. He also began slowly to prepare the ground for his own version of the truth. This was the next stage of the war. Not who had done what, everyone could guess that now. The war was about narrative. Who would be seen as the victim? Who would be seen as the adult? Who would be seen as the one trying to hold things together? The palace was used to controlling narrative through silence. In this new environment, silence was no longer control. Silence was a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by tabloids. By 1994, Diana was not as withdrawn as she had claimed she would be. She could not stay away. Her work mattered to her, and she knew it mattered to others. She began to reappear more, taking on engagements that felt purposeful. She also began to show a different style, less girlish, more sleek, more self-possessed. Her clothing choices shifted, not into scandal but into confidence. The shoulders became sharper. The lines became cleaner. She looked less like a young bride being dressed and more like a woman dressing herself. This unsettled the palace. In a quiet way, it signaled independence. It signaled that she was not waiting to be rescued. It signaled that she might not be willing to be gently managed back into place. During these years, the public saw something else too. Diana was funnier. She could be light, she could be playful. The heaviness of trying to be a perfect wife had lifted slightly, and, in the space it left behind, her personality came forward. She teased people at events. She laughed more easily. She sometimes looked for a moment happy. Happiness, when it belongs to Diana, never stays private. It becomes a headline. And headlines inspire questions. Who is she seeing? Who is she with? Who makes her smile like that? The palace feared those questions because romance around Diana was never just romance. It was politics. The mother of a future king could not simply date like a normal woman, even if she desperately wanted normality. Every man near her became a possible scandal, a possible threat, a possible destabilizing force. At the same time, Diana's emotional life was still fragile. The relationships that had offered comfort were not stable foundations. Hewitt drifted further out of her life, and with distance came bitterness and vulnerability. Diana tried to move on, but moving on for her was complicated. She did not simply stop caring. She held on until it hurt too much. In this period, she became closer to certain friends who could give her what the palace would not: honest conversation, affection without protocol, a place to be herself without being inspected. These friendships mattered. They were her lifeline. They were also, from the palace's perspective, potential leaks. Because Diana had begun to talk. And when Diana talked, the truth spread. The palace tried to keep its own boundaries. It urged her to communicate through official channels. It tried to keep negotiations about her future, her security, her money, and her duties within controlled rooms. Separation required arrangements, and arrangements required lawyers and aides, and discussions about what she would be allowed to do, where she would live, how she would be funded, how she would be positioned. Money decisions were always wrapped in polite language, but they mattered. Diana's lifestyle, her security, her staff, her travel, all cost enormous sums, and those sums had to be justified in a public climate that was growing less patient. The palace wanted to ensure she did not appear to be living like an untouchable queen without the actual job. Diana wanted enough independence to protect herself and her sons. Negotiations are never just about money, they are about power. Who controls access to the children? Who controls the image? Who controls the calendar? Who controls the story? The Queen and her advisors wanted stability. Charles wanted dignity and a future where he could eventually marry the woman he truly loved. Without the country setting fire to the newspapers, Diana wanted respect, safety, and a voice. Each of these wants collided. In June 1994, Charles made a move that changed the balance. He agreed to a televised interview to mark the anniversary of an organization he supported, and in that interview he addressed the marriage. It was the kind of moment the palace usually avoided, because speaking about private matters on television is like opening a window in a storm. But Charles's team believed it was necessary. The public already assumed the worst. If Charles did not speak, he would look evasive forever. In the interview, Charles spoke carefully. He acknowledged that the marriage had broken down. He talked about trying, about duty, about sadness. Then came the question everyone was waiting for. Had he been faithful? Charles said he had been faithful until the marriage had irretrievably broken down, and then, in the plainest terms he would allow himself, he acknowledged he had been unfaithful. The admission was controlled, but it was still an admission. It meant that the heir to the throne had just confirmed the story that had haunted Diana for years. He had confirmed in front of cameras that she had not been imagining it. For Diana, it was both vindication and humiliation. Vindication because the truth was now public. Humiliation because the truth was now public. The public reaction was fierce and oddly split. Some sympathized with Charles, seeing him as trapped in an unhappy marriage. Many sympathized with Diana, seeing her as the wronged wife who had been forced to smile while being betrayed. Newspapers treated it as drama. People talked about it at dinner tables as if they were discussing neighbors, which is the odd intimacy a monarchy invites. Inside the palace, the admission created a new problem. If Charles had publicly acknowledged infidelity, Diana's voice would become even more dangerous if she chose to speak. Because now it was clear that the story had layers, and the public would be hungry for her version of those layers. The palace hoped Diana would respond with restraint, the kind of silence that looks noble. She did not respond immediately with a public counterattack. She was not someone who enjoyed open warfare, but she was someone who, once pushed, would not go quietly. The tension increased around her role. Would she continue as the Princess of Wales in the same way? Would she reduce engagements? Would she speak? Would she cooperate? Diana privately began to harden into a new resolve, not the cold hardening of someone losing empathy, but the hardening of someone deciding she would not be erased. She resumed work that made her feel purposeful. She had visited hospitals again. She supported causes that made the public see her as compassionate rather than merely glamorous. She held on to the moral identity she had built because she sensed it was her strongest shield. A princess can be dismissed as decorative. A woman seen as morally brave is harder to silence. At the same time, she continued to be targeted by stories. Some were true, some were exaggerated, some were invented. She was described as manipulative, unstable, dramatic. The old tactic returned. If you cannot stop a woman from speaking, you can try to make the world doubt her credibility. Diana felt this deeply because credibility was all she had. She did not have constitutional power. She did not have the ability to command armies or pass laws. Her power came from trust. If the public trusted her, she could survive. If they did not, she would be trapped forever as a sad, discarded figure, photographed only when she stumbled. So she became careful, not quiet. She began to choose when to appear and when to vanish. She began to understand that mystery could protect her too, if she used it deliberately rather than being crushed by it. And still the press never stopped hunting. There were nights when Diana could not sleep, not only because of anxiety, but because she could hear, in her mind, the sound of cameras, that clicking, that mechanical swallowing of your face. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being turned into an object every day. You begin to feel as if you are made of paper and everyone else has hands. She leaned on friends more. She leaned on certain staff members who were fiercely loyal. She also leaned on the one thing that always worked when everything else failed. She leaned into a crowd. Because a crowd for Diana was not just noise, it was proof. Proof that she still mattered. Proof that she was not alone. Proof that the palace could not simply close a door and pretend she was gone. In those years, her relationship with her sons deepened. William, now old enough to read headlines and sense the weight of what was happening, began to show signs of worry and protectiveness that would break a mother's heart. Diana tried to shield him, but he lived in the same world she did. He would grow up with his parents' pain as part of his childhood scenery. Harry Younger sensed the tension in different ways. He made jokes. He acted out sometimes. He sought attention. Diana saw it and worried. She did not want her sons to become casualties of the marriage. She wanted them to come out of it still able to trust love. That desire drove many of her decisions. It also made her more stubborn in negotiations with the palace. She wanted access to them. She wanted influence in their upbringing. She wanted them protected not only physically but emotionally. The palace, thinking in centuries, wanted them trained. Diana, thinking in bedtime stories and tears, wanted them understood. These goals were not always compatible. By the time 1994 turned toward 1995, the situation had reached a point where everyone involved understood one thing, even if they disagreed on everything else. The story was not going back in the box. The public had seen the cracks. The press had tasted blood metaphorically, and it would not stop. Charles had spoken. Diana had already spoken through Morton, even if she had not admitted it. The palace's old method of controlling chaos with silence was failing. And Diana, who had once been the shy girl blushing in front of cameras, was now a woman who knew the cameras could be used. The question was not whether she would speak again. The question was how and when and what she would decide to reveal when she did. The question was how and when and what she would decide to reveal when she did. Diana spent much of that year learning the strange art of restraint without surrender. She was still the most photographed woman in Britain, and now she was also the most discussed. Every time she stepped into a car, Someone tried to decide whether her smile looked brave or broken. Every time she went quiet for a few days, someone suggested she was planning a comeback, a breakdown, or both. Inside the palace, people spoke about managing her as if she were weather. They could not stop her existing, but perhaps they could predict her, and prediction felt like control. They watched her staff changes, her friendships, her charity visits, and her private movements. They treated each as a clue. Diana noticed. She had become painfully skilled at noticing. At the same time, she was not living in a purely strategic state. She was still a woman with a heart that kept reaching for tenderness. She wanted to be loved in a way that did not require her to shrink. She wanted a partner who did not treat emotion like a nuisance. She wanted a home that felt safe enough for the nervous system to unclench. The trouble was that nothing around her was built for unclenching. In 1995, a man entered her life who did not arrive with fanfare. He was not glamorous, not part of the celebrity circuit, not a figure who looked good in a tabloid caption. He was a heart surgeon, Hasnat Khan, quiet, serious, devoted to his work. He moved through the world with the calm confidence of someone who had held lives in his hands and understood how little nonsense mattered in an operating room. To Diana, that calm felt like water after years of thirst. Their connection grew privately because it had to. If it became public, it would become a circus, and neither of them wanted to live inside that. Diana wanted someone who saw her as a woman, not a role. Hasnat wanted a life that did not involve being chased by photographers outside a hospital. For a while, Diana managed to keep it hidden. A small miracle given the size of the spotlight on her. She was careful. She used side entrances. She relied on trusted friends. She started to understand that secrecy was not only about hiding. It was about protecting something tender from being turned into entertainment. But secrecy also meant loneliness. She could not simply share her happiness. She had to lock it away, and the effort of locking it away made her feel, again, like she was living two lives. Meanwhile, the palace and Charles were not resting. Charles's camp continued shaping a narrative that made him look dutiful and wronged by circumstance. There were sympathetic profiles. There were stories emphasizing his seriousness, his commitment, his patience. Diana's camp, whether she officially directed it or not, continued emphasizing her warmth and her suffering. The public watched this like a long-running drama, except the children in the story were real. Diana knew that if she wanted to protect herself long-term, she needed more than public affection. She needed her own voice. Placed firmly on the record, she needed to speak in a way that could not be edited into palatable royal language. And then, through a chain of introductions and persuasion, she found herself in conversation with a journalist named Martin Bashir. There are moments in public life when one decision changes everything. Not slowly, not in the gentle way people imagine, in a single cut. Agreeing to speak on television was that kind of decision. Diana was not unaware of the risk. She knew the palace would be furious. She knew the monarchy relied on not discussing its private wounds in public. She also knew that she was being defined by others, daily, and that definition was becoming a cage. If she did not speak, the story would be written without her. If she did speak, she might burn the bridge behind her. But Diana had lived on that bridge for years. She had crossed it in heels, in tears, in public smiles that cost her sleep. She had tried to make the institution feel human. The institution had tried to make her feel manageable. At some point, the question became simple. How much more can you lose before you decide to stop cooperating with your own erasure? The interview was recorded quietly, without the kind of advance warning that would have triggered an immediate shutdown. When it aired in November 1995, it hit Britain like a cold wave. Diana sat in the frame, in a black dress. Her face composed, her voice calm. Calm was important. She did not appear hysterical. She did not appear scattered. She appeared deliberate. And then she began to tell the truth as she saw it. She spoke about bulimia. She spoke about feeling unsupported. She spoke about the loneliness and the emotional isolation. She spoke about her marriage in a way that stripped off the fairy tale wrapping and left the ordinary pain underneath. Then came the line that froze in the culture instantly, because it was so plain and so devastating. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She said it without shouting. That was part of the power. She spoke as if she was stating a fact, not trying to win a fight. And in that moment, the whole country felt the marriage tilt. It was no longer rumour. It was no longer tabloid speculation. It was the Princess of Wales speaking plainly. She also spoke about the monarchy itself, carefully but clearly. She talked about not fitting, about the pressures, about how difficult it was to be inside a system that offered so little emotional support. She spoke about Charles's suitability, about her own doubts, about the kind of person she believed she was. She positioned herself as someone who wanted to do good, not as someone trying to tear everything down. But the damage from the palace's point of view was done. She had broken the most sacred rule. She had made the private public in her own voice. The reaction behind the scenes was immediate and severe. Courtiers did not shout in corridors. They tightened their faces, closed doors, and began calling people in. Telephones rang. Meetings appeared. The air inside the household turned sharp, like metal. The Queen, who had watched decades of political storms with steady discipline, now faced something that felt deeply personal and deeply institutional at the same time. Diana's interview was not just a family matter. It was a constitutional problem, in the sense that it threatened the monarchy's emotional contract with the public. The monarchy could not look like a soap opera and still demand reverence. Reverence is fragile. It does not survive too much detail. In the public, the palace kept its composure. It always did. There were no dramatic statements, no open shouting matches, just quiet, tense lines about the matter being private and the family continuing its duties. In private, the tone was different. Diana had crossed the line. The question now was how to respond without making her look even more like a victim, because she was adored, and punishing an adored woman tends to backfire. Charles, too, faced a turning point. The interview had made him look weak, unfaithful, and emotionally inadequate. He could not afford to have the future king's image defined by the words of his separated wife. His advisers urged firmness. The institution needed closure. It needed the story to stop bleeding. Diana's supporters urged her to brace for retaliation. They were right. The months after the interview were a brutal mixture of public empathy and private tightening. Diana was praised by many for her honesty. She was also attacked, described as unstable, manipulative, attention-seeking. People debated her motives as if motives mattered more than the pain described. Some said she was brave. Some said she was reckless. Some said both, depending on the day. Diana herself experienced a strange calm after the storm. She had spoken. She had released the story. She could not put it back. That could feel like relief, but relief did not mean safety. The palace moved toward a conclusion it had been avoiding because conclusions create headlines too. Divorce. For a long time, divorce had been treated as unthinkable for the heir. Separation was already painful. Divorce felt like admitting failure. But after the interview, the marriage was not simply broken, it was publicly broken. There was no way to pretend they might reconcile. The idea would look ridiculous, and the monarchy cannot afford to look ridiculous. In December 1995, the Queen wrote to Charles and Diana, urging them to consider divorce. The word itself, once unthinkable, was now a tool for ending the chaos. Negotiations began, and negotiations are never romantic. They are about money, titles, living arrangements, access to children, security, and who gets to keep what symbols. Diana wanted stability. She wanted enough financial independence to live without constant dependence on Charles's household. She wanted secure housing. She wanted her sons protected. She wanted to keep a meaningful role, because being discarded would not just hurt her. It would hurt the boys. The palace wanted her contained. It wanted her supported enough not to complain publicly again, but not empowered enough to become a rival court at royal gloss. It wanted her close enough to the family to avoid looking cruel, but far enough away to reduce the daily drama. Charles wanted to move forward. He wanted a future where his personal life could eventually be aligned with his public one. He also wanted the boys' lives to remain stable and his own authority to remain intact. Diana fought harder than people expected, not with courtroom theatrics, but with a steady insistence. She was not going to be quietly minimized. In 1996, the divorce was finalized. On August 28, 1996, Charles and Diana were no longer married. The details mattered in the way details always matter when power is being redistributed. Diana received a settlement that ensured financial security. She kept her residence at Kensington Palace and continued to be known as Diana, Princess of Wales. But she lost something that stung in a way few people outside that world understood. She lost the style of Her Royal Highness. In that world, those words are not just etiquette. They are status, they are access. They determine who must bow first, who takes precedence, who is treated as central. Losing them meant Diana was no longer formally at the top of the family hierarchy. It meant she was, in a way, being placed just outside. Diana was furious, not because she cared about fancy phrases for their own sake, but because she understood what it symbolized. She was being told in official language that she was no longer fully part of the family she had given her youth to, even though she would always be the mother of a future king. The palace, for its part, believed it needed that line drawn. If Diana remained styled as if she were still royal in the fullest sense, she could claim a level of authority that would complicate everything. The institution chose clarity over kindness. Diana took it as a wound. She also took it as information. She was now officially freer. She was also officially less protected. After the divorce, Diana tried to build a life that felt like hers. She was 35, still young, but shaped by years of strain. The world expected her to either collapse or reinvent herself dramatically. She did neither immediately. She did what many people do after long public heartbreak. She focused on her children. William and Harry were the anchor. With them she could be a mother, not a symbol. She organized their lives, their holidays, their routines. She worked to keep them emotionally steady in a world that was anything but. At the same time, she began to choose her work with more freedom. She did not have to coordinate every move with Charles's calendar. She could pick courses that mattered to her without negotiating every detail. This was liberating, and also frightening because it meant she owned the consequences. She leaned into causes that fit her moral identity. She continued to support people with human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immune deficiency syndrome. She continued her work with those facing stigma and suffering. She began to take on another issue that would define her final year and terrify powerful people for a different reason: landmines. Landmines were one of those hidden horrors that stayed out of mind for people living comfortable lives. They did not make glamorous headlines. They did not belong to tidy charity galas. They belonged to distant fields where children ran and then did not come home the same. They belonged to farmers who lost legs and livelihoods. They belonged to wars that had officially ended, but still left death in the soil. Diana's interest in landmines was not academic, it was human. She listened to stories, she met survivors, she saw the photographs. She understood instantly that this was the kind of cause where a famous person could force attention where politicians had allowed neglect. In January 1997, she traveled to Angola with a charity organization working on landmine removal. The trip was dangerous, the kind of trip the palace would once have carefully controlled, if it allowed it at all. Now Diana was not bound in the same way. She could choose it. She walked through a cleared path in a minefield wearing protective gear, a visor, a flak jacket. The images were striking not because she looked glamorous, but because she looked real. A princess walking through a place designed to kill children. The photographs were everywhere. They did what she always did at her best. They made an abstract issue feel personal. Some politicians grumbled. They said she was meddling. They said she was being used by campaigners. They said she did not understand the complexities. Diana did not respond with policy arguments. She responded with the simplest moral logic. Children should not lose their legs to weapons left behind after men have finished fighting. The public agreed. Charities benefited. Pressure built. People who liked to move slowly began to feel pushed. The palace watched with its familiar mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride because she was still doing good and making Britain look compassionate. Anxiety because she was doing it independently, as a private citizen with royal charisma. A private citizen should not be able to shape global conversations in the way she could. That was not how the system liked power distributed. Diana also continued her relationship with Hasnat Khan, though by now it was under strain. The deeper the relationship became, the more the practical questions rose, like walls. Could he live with the attention? Could he live with the expectations? Could he live inside the web that surrounded her? Hasnat was not seduced by fame. He wanted a normal life. Diana wanted normal life too, but she could not have it. Not truly. Normal life had been sold away the day she stepped into the cathedral in white. Diana considered what it would mean to marry again, and the thought itself was explosive. The mother of the future king marrying a private man, possibly a man outside the established social and religious expectations of the royal world, would trigger controversy. The palace would not welcome it. The press would treat it like sport. The man involved would lose his privacy forever. Hasnat, cautious and practical, resisted the idea. Diana, romantic and hungry for a safe home, felt crushed by that resistance. She wanted a future that did not feel like endless waiting. The relationship began to wobble. Diana tried to hold on. Hasnat tried to protect his life. Love, when placed under that kind of pressure, tends to crack. In the summer of 1997, Diana accepted an invitation that seemed like a break, a chance to breathe. Mohammed Al-Fayed, a wealthy businessman, offered her time on his yacht in the Mediterranean. His son, Dodi Fayed, would be there. The invitation promised sun, privacy, distance from the British press. Privacy for Diana was a rare luxury. She wanted it. She also wanted to show the world she was not broken. After divorce, a woman in her position is expected to either retreat or prove she is still alive. Diana did not want to be pitied. She wanted to be seen as vibrant. She went. At first, it looked like a holiday. Photographs appeared of her on the yacht, relaxed, smiling, the sea behind her. But photographs are never neutral when you are her. They are stories waiting for captions. Rumors ignited almost immediately. Diana and Dodi, Diana and a new love, Diana and a new life. Newspapers treated it like a romance novel written in real time. The truth is that relationships do not always begin with a thunderclap. Sometimes they begin with company, with shared meals, with laughter. Diana and Dodi spent time together, and the world decided what it wanted that time to mean. Dodi was charming, wealthy, and used to a certain kind of attention. Diana was famous beyond his world and exhausted by it. Together they created a media frenzy that neither could fully control, partly because the frenzy had its own fuel. Editors wanted a story. Photographers wanted a shot. The public wanted romance after tragedy. Diana's friends were worried. They worried that she was being used, that the relationship was being pushed, for reasons that had more to do with image and revenge than with love. They worried that Diana's vulnerability made her easy to steer. They worried too about the press. The more visible her life became, the more dangerous it became. Diana herself had mixed feelings. There were moments when she seemed happy, genuinely. There were moments when she seemed uncertain. She was trying to find footing in a world where every step became a headline. She also did something in that final summer that suggests her mind was not made up, that she was still searching for stability, rather than simply chasing romance. She continued to reach out to Hasnat Khan, even as she spent time with Dodi. She was not someone who could turn her heart off like a switch. She carried attachments, even when they hurt. The summer moved quickly. Diana spent time with her sons, then returned to the Mediterranean. She moved between worlds: mother, humanitarian, global icon, private woman, trying to be loved. In August 1997, after days on the yacht, Diana and Dodi travelled to Paris. It was meant to be brief, a stop between places. A chance to shop, to rest, to have dinner away from the British press. But the press was not only British, and Diana's fame was not local. Photographers tracked them. Cars waited. Cameras clicked. The pursuit that had haunted Diana for years was now a constant hum. That night on August 30th, and into the early hours of August 31st, Diana and Dodi left the Ritz Hotel in Paris. They tried to slip away from photographers by using a decoy car and leaving from a side entrance. These were the tactics of people who had been hunted long enough to learn tricks. The chase began anyway. It is important to say this with care. A tragedy like this is not entertainment. It is real, and it has victims. It has families who live with the consequences. But it is also part of the story because it reveals the final, brutal consequence of everything that had been building for years. When you turn a woman into a public object, you create an industry around her. When the industry grows hungry, it becomes reckless. The car entered the Pont de l'Alme tunnel. Moments later, it crashed. Dodi fired, died, the driver, Henri Paul, died. Diana was critically injured. Her bodyguard survived. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana died in hospital. The news travelled faster than grief could form. People woke up and turned on televisions and saw the words and felt disbelief. It did not fit the story people had been telling themselves. She was not supposed to die. She was supposed to keep walking into crowds, smiling, making the world kinder. She was supposed to be the symbol that survived the institution. Britain reacted with a kind of collective shock that is hard to describe if you did not live through it. People poured into the streets. They gathered outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, not as polite tourists, but as mourners who felt they had lost someone personal. They brought flowers in such quantities that the air itself seemed scented with grief. They brought cards, stuffed animals, notes written in shaky handwriting. They stood in silence. They cried openly. Grown men who had never cried in public cried. Women who had watched her wedding as young mothers now stood with their own children and sobbed. The palace, trained for restraint, did not know what to do with that level of emotion. In the days after her death, the monarchy faced one of the most dangerous moments of its modern life, not because of politics, but because of feeling. The public's grief included anger, and anger is a fire that does not respect tradition. People wanted the royal family to respond in a way that matched the scale of the loss. They wanted flags lowered. They wanted statements that sounded human. They wanted to physically see, that the family understood what had happened. The palace moved slowly at first, because it always moved slowly. The Queen was at Balmoral with William and Harry, trying to protect them from the worst of the storm. That instinct was maternal and understandable. It was also misread by a public that wanted visible mourning. The press began to turn on the palace. Commentators asked why the flag was not lowered at Buckingham Palace. People asked why there was no immediate statement. People asked in plain, angry terms whether the family that had benefited from Diana's popularity now looked cold in her death. This was the moment when the palace's fear of Diana reached its final irony. In life, they feared her emotional power. In death, that emotional power became a national wave, and they were standing in the path of it. The Queen eventually returned to London. The family made statements. The flag was lowered. The public response softened slightly, not because the grief ended, but because people saw movement. They saw acknowledgement. On September the 6th, 1997, Diana's funeral took place. It was watched by millions around the world. The streets filled with mourners. The procession moved through London with a gravity that made the city feel hushed. Her coffin was covered with the royal standard, and on top sat flowers and a card that read "Mummy." William and Harry walked behind the coffin, young boys in public grief, accompanied by Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. It is impossible to watch that image without feeling a tightening in the throat. Whatever people thought about Diana, about Charles, about the monarchy, the sight of children walking behind their mother's coffin did something to the public. It pierced the drama and left only loss. In the service, Diana's brother delivered a speech that was both tribute and accusation. He spoke about her as a unique spirit, about the pressures she faced, about the way the media pursued her. He pledged to protect her sons. He criticized the institutions that had failed her, openly, in front of the world. The palace sat and listened. It had no choice. The public responded with applause, which is unusual in a funeral service, and it revealed again the truth the palace had spent years trying to manage. Diana's bond with the public was not formal. It was emotional, and emotion has its own etiquette. After the funeral, the world did what it always does. It moved forward. People went back to work. The flowers wilted. The headlines shifted. But something had changed permanently. The monarchy understood that it could not survive the modern era by behaving as if it was still in the 19th century. The public's relationship with royalty had become more conditional. People wanted humanity, not just ceremony. Diana had taught them to want it. William and Harry grew up under that shadow, their mother's death shaping them in ways that would become clear later. William learned the discipline of the future king, but also carried the memory of a mother who had insisted on feeling. Harry carried the anger and the grief in a different way, sometimes loudly, sometimes painfully. As for the palace, it tried to return to stability, because stability is what it does. It tried to fold Diana into a narrative that could be honored without being disruptive. It praised her charity work. It spoke of her as a devoted mother. It avoided the messier truths when it could. But Diana's story resisted tidiness. She had never been tidy. That was the point. Her legacy became a complicated living thing. People remembered the handshake with the patient everyone else avoided. They remembered her walking through a minefield to force the world to look at what it had ignored. They remembered her holding children, laughing with strangers, making nurses feel seen. They also remembered the pain, the marriage, the betrayal, the loneliness inside palaces, the way she had been adored and still not protected. And because she had spoken in her own voice, the memory could not be fully rewritten. Her recordings, her interview, her choices, They remained part of the record, resisting the softening that institutions prefer. This is why she terrified the palace, and why everyone knew why, even if they could not always articulate it. She revealed the institution's oldest weakness. It could survive political storms, wars, scandals, even family unhappiness, as long as it controlled the story. Diana was a person who made the story human, and once a story becomes human, control becomes harder. She did not set out to start a revolution. She wanted love, and she wanted belonging. She wanted a happy home. She wanted a husband who held her hand in private the way she held strangers' hands in public. But by trying to get those ordinary needs met inside an extraordinary system, she exposed the system's limits. She showed how little space there was for a woman to be both royal and real. She showed how quickly a woman could be celebrated for her beauty and dismissed for her pain. She showed how loyalty inside the palace was often loyalty to the crown rather than loyalty to the people wearing the crown. And she showed the public something else, something the public never forgot. That compassion could be practiced like a daily habit, not saved for speeches. That a touch could break fear. That a person with no formal political power could still change behavior, still shape conscience, still force attention onto suffering. In the end, the most frightening thing about Diana was not that she could attract cameras. The palace had always lived with cameras. It was that she could attract hearts. And once hearts moved toward her, the monarchy had to follow, whether it wanted to or not.